History of the world from 10,000 BC to 5000 BC. The end of the Ice Age and a changing world. Around 9700 BC, the Earth underwent one of the most dramatic climate shifts in recent geological history. The Younger Dryas, a cold period that had gripped much of the northern hemisphere, came to an abrupt end. In Greenland, temperatures rose by as much as 10 degrees Celsius within just a few decades. This wasn't a gradual warming, but a climate flip that marked the beginning of a new epoch in Earth's history, the Holocene. The world as humans had known it for thousands of years was about to transform in ways that would reshape every aspect of life on the planet. To understand the magnitude of this change, we need to picture the world as it existed before this moment. For more than 1,000 years, the Younger Dryas had held the northern hemisphere in its grip. Just when the Ice Age seemed to be loosening its hold, when glaciers had begun their retreat and the climate had started to warm, the cold had returned. The Younger Dryas was a final gasp of glacial conditions, a climatic reversal that brought back near-Ice Age conditions to much of Europe, Asia, and North America. Glaciers that had been melting began to advance again. Forests retreated. The tundra expanded. For the humans living through this period, it must have seemed as though winter would never truly end. But then, with startling suddenness, it did end. The ice core records from Greenland tell us that the transition was astonishingly rapid. Within the span of a few decades, perhaps even within a single human lifetime, the world changed. Temperatures soared. The cold, dry conditions that had persisted gave way to warmth and moisture. The Holocene epoch had begun, and with it came a climate stability that would persist for thousands of years. This stability would prove crucial for the development of human civilization, providing the predictable conditions necessary for agriculture and settled life. By 9000 BC, the massive ice sheets that had covered much of the northern continents during the Pleistocene were in full retreat. These weren't merely large glaciers, they were continent-spanning masses of ice, in some places more than a mile thick. The Laurentide ice sheet had covered virtually all of Canada and extended deep into what is now the northern United States. The Fennoscandian ice sheet had buried Scandinavia and reached across the Baltic into northern Europe. The ice had been so heavy that it had literally pressed the land beneath it downward, deforming the Earth's crust under its weight. Now, these glaciers were melting. The retreat wasn't uniform or steady. There were pauses, even brief re-advances. But the overall trend was undeniable. The ice was disappearing. In North America, the southern edge of the ice sheet was pulling back northward, exposing landscapes that had been buried under ice for tens of thousands of years. Fresh bedrock, scraped clean by the glaciers, saw sunlight for the first time in millennia. Lakes formed in the depressions carved by the ice. Rivers found new courses across the transformed landscape. In Europe, the story was similar. The great ice sheet that had covered Scandinavia was thinning and retreating. The British Isles, which had been connected to the European continent by exposed sea floor during the Ice Age's lowest sea levels, were beginning their transformation into islands, though that process would take several more millennia to complete. Only in high elevations, in places like the Scottish Highlands, did remnant ice persist, clinging to the mountains even as the lowlands warmed and greened. The melting of these enormous ice sheets had profound consequences. All that frozen water had to go somewhere, and it went into the oceans. 10,000 years ago, global sea level stood roughly 38 meters, about 125 feet, lower than it does today. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the height of a 12-story building. Entire continental shelves that are now underwater were dry land. The geography of the world looked fundamentally different. Coastlines extended far beyond their modern positions. In Southeast Asia, many of what are now islands were connected to the mainland. The North Sea between Britain and Europe was largely dry land. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The waters between Siberia and Alaska were a broad plain. Communities lived and hunted on lands that are now dozens of meters beneath the waves. And then the seas began their inexorable rise. The rate at which sea level rose during this period was remarkable. In the early part of this era, the oceans were rising at an average rate of nearly 2 centimeters per year. That might not sound like much, but over a human lifetime of, say, 50 years, that's a full meter of sea level rise. Over a century, 2 meters. Over 5 centuries, 10 meters. Coastal settlements had to move. Hunting grounds were drowned. River valleys became estuaries, then bays, then open sea. The rise wasn't constant or smooth. It varied from place to place and from century to century, depending on local factors and the rate at which different ice sheets melted. But the overall trend was unmistakable. The world's oceans were reclaiming land, redrawing maps, and forcing human populations to adapt or relocate. This was a slow-motion catastrophe by human standards, unfolding over generations, but it was transformative nonetheless. The warming climate brought more than just melting ice and rising water. It fundamentally reshaped the living world. Around 10,000 BC, as temperatures climbed and precipitation patterns shifted across the globe, the habitats that had sustained Ice Age wildlife began to disappear. The Mammoth Steppe, that vast grassland ecosystem that had stretched across the northern latitudes from Spain to Alaska, was vanishing. This ecosystem, which had no real modern equivalent, had been characterized by cold, dry conditions that maintained productive grasslands even at high latitudes. These grasslands had supported enormous herds of large herbivores, mammoths, mastodons, horses, bison, caribou, and many others. The biomass of large animals on the Mammoth Steppe may have been greater than that of any modern ecosystem. But the Mammoth Steppe required specific climatic conditions to persist. It needed the cold, dry climate of the Ice Age. As the Holocene brought warmer, wetter conditions, the character of the vegetation changed. In many areas, grasslands gave way to shrublands, then to forests. The productivity of the landscape, at least for large grazing animals, declined. The habitat was shifting out from under the very animals that had defined it. And with the loss of habitat came the loss of species. The great megafauna of the Ice Age, animals that had thrived for hundreds of thousands of years, now faced extinction. In North America, woolly mammoths vanished, along with mastodons, horses, camels, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and dozens of other species. In South America, the losses were even more severe, with entire families of large mammals disappearing. Europe lost its woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears, and giant deer. Australia had already lost most of its megafauna in earlier millennia, but the process continued. The causes of these extinctions have been debated for decades. Climate change clearly played a role. As habitats shifted and productivity changed, populations of large animals declined. But climate alone may not explain the extinctions, because many of these species had survived previous climate shifts during earlier interglacial periods. Human hunting pressure likely contributed as well, particularly in regions where humans were newly arrived and the animals had no evolutionary experience with human predators. The reality was probably a combination. Climate change stressed the populations, reduced their habitat, and limited their ability to recover from hunting pressure. Together, these factors proved fatal. Whatever the precise causes, the result was clear. Continent by continent, the great megafauna disappeared, leaving behind only their bones buried in the earth and the images of them painted and carved by the humans who had known them. The world was becoming a smaller place, at least in terms of the size of its animals. The age of giants was ending. But even as some habitats and species disappeared, new ones were emerging. The changing climate didn't just eliminate, it also created. In Europe and the Near East, forests began their march northward and upward into areas that had been open tundra or steppe. This wasn't an instantaneous transformation, but a gradual succession that unfolded over centuries. Birch and pine were typically the pioneers, hardy trees that could tolerate the newly warming conditions and colonize open ground. Behind them came other species, oak, elm, hazel, and lime in Europe, different assemblages of trees in other regions. In some areas, the transformation was relatively rapid. Open tundra, supporting herds of reindeer and supporting a lifestyle of mobile hunting, could transform into dense forest within a few human generations. These new forests were rich in their own way, but they offered different resources than the open landscapes they replaced. Instead of large herding animals visible across vast distances, the forests held solitary deer, wild boar, and smaller game. Instead of relying on the seasonal migrations of reindeer or horses, human groups had to learn to exploit nuts, berries, roots, and the dispersed resources of the woodland. This required adaptation. The hunting strategies that had worked on the open steppe were less effective in dense forest. New tools and new techniques were needed. The bow and arrow, which may have been invented during this period or shortly before, was better suited to forest hunting than the throwing spears of the Ice Age. Ways of life had to change to match the changing world. The rising seas that were transforming coastlines around the world also severed connections between landmasses that had been joined during the Ice Age. One of the most significant separations occurred in the far north, where Asia and North America had been joined by a broad plain of land called Beringia. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today, the shallow sea floor of the Bering Strait had been exposed as dry land. This wasn't merely a narrow bridge, but a substantial landmass, a subcontinent in its own right, stretching hundreds of kilometers from north to south. Beringia had its own ecosystem, its own climate, its own character. It served as a refugium for plants and animals during the coldest periods of the Ice Age, and as a corridor for movement between the continents. Plants, animals, and humans had all crossed this land bridge, moving between Asia and North America. The first peoples to enter the Americas almost certainly came this way, though the exact timing and nature of that migration is still debated. What is clear is that Beringia served as a highway between the Old World and the New for thousands of years. But as the ice melted and the seas rose, the waters began to encroach on this connection. The inundation was gradual but inexorable. First, the lowest areas were flooded, creating islands and narrow straits. Then, as the water continued to rise, these islands shrank and the straits widened. By around 8,500 BC, the process was complete. The rising waters had claimed the last of the land bridge. The Bering Strait, as we know it today, had formed. Siberia and Alaska, once parts of a continuous landscape where humans and animals could move freely back and forth, were now separated by water. This separation had profound consequences. The peoples of the Americas were now cut off from direct land contact with Asia. While there may have been occasional contact by boat in later periods, the easy exchange of people, ideas, animals, and plants was over. The populations of the New World would develop in relative isolation for thousands of years, creating civilizations, domesticating their own plants and animals, and following their own historical trajectories largely independent of developments in the Old World. This, then, was the world of 10,000 to 9,000 BC, a world in flux, where climate, landscape, and life itself were all in dramatic transition. The stable, predictable patterns of the Ice Age, which had persisted for tens of thousands of years, were gone. In their place came something new, the Holocene world, a world of forests and rising seas, of extinct giants and new possibilities. The stage was set for the next great chapter in human history, one that would see the emergence of agriculture, settled villages, and eventually, civilization itself. But in these early centuries of the Holocene, those developments still lay in the future. For now, human societies were adapting, learning to thrive in a world that was fundamentally different from the one their ancestors had known. Human adaptation in a new world. As the ice retreated and the climate stabilized in the 10th millennium BC, the human population of the entire Earth was remarkably small by modern standards. Estimates suggest that between 1 and 10 million people inhabited the entire planet during this period. To put that in perspective, today there are individual cities with populations larger than the entire human species possessed 10,000 years ago. These few million people were scattered across the continents, living primarily in small foraging bands that moved with the seasons, following game animals and the ripening of wild plants. These weren't crowded times. In many regions, you could walk for days without encountering another human group. Population density varied considerably depending on the richness of local resources. Coastal areas, river valleys, and regions with abundant game might support somewhat larger and more settled communities. But vast stretches of the interior, particularly in the Americas, Northern Asia, and Australia, held only the most scattered populations. Human life existed in archipelagos of occupation, clusters of people separated by empty or nearly empty lands. Most of these people lived in what we would call foraging bands, groups of perhaps 20 to 50 individuals, often related by kinship, who moved regularly across a territory in search of food. These weren't aimless wanderings. Foraging groups possessed deep knowledge of their landscapes. They knew where certain plants would be available at certain times of year. They knew the migration routes of animals. They knew where to find water during dry seasons. Their movements followed regular patterns refined over generations of experience. This way of life, hunting and gathering, had sustained humanity for hundreds of thousands of years. It was the fundamental human economic pattern, the baseline of human existence. But in some regions, particularly in the Near East, something new was beginning to emerge. Small-scale experiments with plant cultivation were underway. People were paying special attention to certain wild grasses, to wild wheat and barley, learning their properties, perhaps beginning to deliberately plant seeds and protect growing areas. These experiments were tentative, supplemental to hunting and gathering rather than replacing it. The full agricultural revolution still lay in the future. But the seeds of that revolution, both literally and figuratively, were being planted during these centuries. As humans adapted to the changing world of the early Holocene, their technologies evolved as well. One of the most important technological shifts of this era involved hunting weapons. The bow and arrow, which had been invented in the late Ice Age, became increasingly widespread during the early Holocene. This wasn't a sudden replacement of older technologies, but a gradual spread as the advantages of the bow became apparent and as the knowledge of bow-making diffused from group to group and region to region. The bow and arrow represented a significant advance in projectile weaponry. Compared to the spears and javelins of earlier eras, the bow offered several advantages. It had greater range, allowing hunters to strike game from farther away. It was more accurate, at least in the hands of a skilled archer. The arrow flew faster than a thrown spear, giving the prey less time to react. And crucially, a hunter could carry many arrows but only a few spears. The bow was particularly well suited to the forested environments that were spreading across much of the northern hemisphere as the climate warmed. In dense woodland, the ability to make a quick, accurate shot at a deer glimpsed between the trees was more valuable than the ability to throw a heavy spear across open ground. But the spread of the bow didn't mean the immediate abandonment of older technologies. The spear thrower, known as an atlatl in the Americas, remained an important weapon in many regions. The spear thrower was a lever device that effectively extended the length of a hunter's arm, allowing them to throw a spear or dart with much greater force and distance than was possible with the arm alone. An experienced user of a spear thrower could strike prey at considerable range and could generate enough force to bring down even large animals. In the Americas particularly, the spear thrower remained the dominant projectile weapon for thousands of years after this period. Recent archaeological evidence has revealed something interesting about who used these weapons. Analysis of burial remains and hunting injuries suggests that both men and women participated in big game hunting with spear throwers around 9,000 years ago. This challenges older assumptions that hunting large animals was exclusively a male activity. The evidence indicates that in some cultures, women were active participants in the hunt, skilled in the use of these powerful weapons, and capable of bringing down the same large game that men hunted. This makes sense when we consider the nature of these societies. In small foraging bands, everyone's contribution mattered. While there may have been some division of labor by gender, it likely wasn't as rigid as it became in later agricultural societies. Flexibility and the ability of all members of the group to contribute in multiple ways would have been advantageous. If a hunting opportunity arose, whoever was available and capable would participate, regardless of gender. The idea of strict gender roles in hunting may be more a reflection of later agricultural societies than of the fluid, adaptable foraging bands of the early Holocene. Another important technology that existed by the 10th millennium BC, though one that often leaves little trace in the archaeological record, was the boat. Simple watercraft, primarily dugout canoes, were already in use. These weren't sophisticated vessels with sails or complex construction. They were straightforward solutions to the problem of crossing water. A large log, hollowed out by a combination of fire and stone tools, shaped into a basic hull that could float and be paddled. Despite their simplicity, these dugout boats expanded the range of human activity considerably. Rivers that might have been barriers became highways. Lakes could be crossed rather than circumnavigated. Coastal communities could fish in deeper water and could travel along shorelines to reach new resource areas. Islands that were visible from the mainland could be reached. The boat, even in its most basic form, was a liberating technology, one that opened up new dimensions of the landscape to human exploitation. The existence of boats by this period is demonstrated by several lines of evidence. Human populations had reached islands that were never connected to the mainland by land bridges, which means they must have arrived by boat. Archaeological sites near water sometimes preserve remains of fish that could only have been caught from boats. And in a few fortunate cases, actual remains of ancient boats have been preserved in waterlogged deposits, allowing us to see directly what these early watercraft looked like. They were functional rather than elegant, designed for utility rather than speed or comfort. But they worked, and they expanded the human niche to include the aquatic realm. These technological adaptations, the bow, the spear thrower, the boat, all reflect a fundamental human characteristic: the ability to innovate in response to environmental change and opportunity. As the world changed around them, as forests replaced grasslands and seas rose to drown coastlines, humans didn't simply accept these changes passively. They developed new tools, new strategies, new ways of extracting resources from their environments. This adaptability, more than any single technology, was perhaps humanity's greatest strength during this period of dramatic environmental transition. But humans weren't adapting to the changing world alone. They had a companion, one that had been with them for thousands of years already by the 10th millennium BC. The dog, humanity's first domesticated animal, was already an established part of human society during this period. The domestication of dogs had occurred thousands of years earlier, probably sometime during the late Ice Age, long before the domestication of any other animal and certainly long before the domestication of crops. The exact timing and location of dog domestication is still debated by scientists. Genetic evidence suggests it may have occurred more than 15,000 years ago, possibly in multiple locations. What is clear is that by the early Holocene, dogs were widespread, living with human communities across much of Eurasia and the Americas. Archaeological sites from this period sometimes contain dog burials, suggesting that these animals held some special status, that they were valued members of the community rather than merely tolerated hangers-on. The partnership between humans and dogs was mutually beneficial. Dogs provided services that were valuable to foraging communities. They could help with hunting, tracking wounded game, cornering prey, or alerting hunters to the presence of animals. They served as guards, warning of the approach of predators or rival human groups. In cold climates, they provided warmth at night. They helped with cleaning up camp refuse. And they provided companionship, a social bond that went beyond mere utility. For the dog's part, association with humans provided access to food scraps, protection, and a social structure they could fit into. Dogs are descended from wolves, social animals that live in hierarchical packs. Human foraging bands may have offered a similar social structure that dogs could integrate into, treating humans as pack members and fitting themselves into the human social hierarchy. The presence of dogs with human communities in the early Holocene, thousands of years before the domestication of sheep, goats, cattle, or pigs, tells us something important about the human relationship with animals. Humans didn't domesticate animals solely for practical, economic reasons. The first domestication was of a predator, an animal that competed with humans for game. Dogs weren't domesticated to be eaten, at least not primarily. They were domesticated for companionship, for help with hunting, for protection. The relationship was social as much as economic. This suggests that the human capacity for forming bonds with other species, for seeing animals as companions rather than merely as resources, is ancient and deep-rooted. Life in the 10th millennium BC was, by modern standards, materially simple but not necessarily impoverished. The people of this era possessed deep knowledge of their environments. They could identify hundreds of plant species, knowing which were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous. They could read tracks and signs, interpreting the stories written in disturbed earth and broken branches. They knew animal behavior, understanding the habits and patterns of dozens of species. They possessed practical skills in stoneworking, in fire making, in leatherworking, in the construction of shelters, in the making of cordage and baskets. Their social lives were rich and complex. Small foraging bands weren't isolated units. They maintained connections with neighboring groups through periodic gatherings, through intermarriage, through trade of valuable materials like high-quality stone for tools or shells for decoration. They possessed language, art, music, ritual, and religion. They told stories, passing down knowledge and tradition from generation to generation. They cared for their sick and elderly. They buried their dead, sometimes with grave goods that suggest belief in an afterlife. These were fully modern humans, with the same cognitive capacities as people today. If you could somehow transport an infant from 10,000 BC to the present and raise them in a modern family, they would be indistinguishable from any other child. And if you could transport a modern infant back to that era, they would grow up to be a capable member of a foraging band, learning the skills and knowledge necessary to thrive in that environment. The difference between then and now isn't one of intelligence or capability, but of accumulated knowledge, technology, and social organization. The world of the 10th millennium BC was a world in transition, caught between the Ice Age past and the agricultural future. The climate was stabilizing, providing the predictable conditions that would eventually allow agriculture to flourish. But agriculture, true farming with domesticated crops and livestock as the primary food source, was still thousands of years away for most regions. For now, humanity remained what it had always been, communities of skilled foragers, using increasingly sophisticated tools to hunt and gather wild resources, adapting to new environments as forests spread and seas rose. They possessed ancient technologies refined over millennia: the bow and spear thrower, the dugout boat, the ability to make fire and work stone and hide. They lived in small bands, moving with the seasons, following the cycles of nature. And they had companions, dogs that had already been part of human society for thousands of years, partners in the hunt and guards in the night. This was the human condition as the Holocene began, a way of life that had sustained our species for hundreds of thousands of years, and one that would continue for thousands more in many parts of the world, even as some regions began the slow, uncertain experiments that would eventually lead to farming, villages, cities, and civilization. The Cradle of Cultivation. While much of the world remained in the domain of mobile foraging bands in the millennia around 10,000 BC, something remarkable was happening in a corner of the Near East. In the region known as the Levant, the narrow strip of land bordering the eastern Mediterranean, including parts of modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, human communities were beginning to live in ways that hadn't been seen before. They were settling down, building permanent structures, and beginning a relationship with plants that would eventually transform human existence. This was the cradle of agriculture, though the people living through these changes could hardly have known they were beginning a revolution. The story begins with a culture we call the Natufian, which flourished in the Levant roughly between 12,500 and 9,500 BC. The Natufians weren't farmers, not in any sense we would recognize. They were foragers, hunters and gatherers who depended on wild resources. But they were unlike the mobile foraging bands that characterized most of human existence up to that point. The Natufians were semi-sedentary. They built villages, permanent structures where they lived for at least part of the year, perhaps year-round in some favorable locations. What made this possible? The answer lies in the unusual richness of the Levantine environment during this period. The region was blessed with an abundance of wild resources, particularly wild cereals. Wild wheat and barley grew in dense stands in the uplands. These grains could be harvested in large quantities during their brief season of ripeness, and crucially, they could be stored. With the right processing, removing the husks and drying the grains, they would keep for months, providing food long after the harvest season ended. This storable surplus of wild grain was the foundation that allowed people to stay in one place rather than constantly moving in search of food. The Natufians built villages of circular stone houses, sometimes partly dug into the ground for insulation. They created storage pits for their harvested grain. They made grinding stones, mortars and pestles for processing cereals into flour. They made sickles, tools with flint blades set into handles of wood or bone, designed specifically for harvesting grain stalks. These sickles show a distinctive polish on their cutting edges, a microscopic smoothing caused by repeated contact with the silica in cereal stems, telling us exactly what they were used for. Natufian society had other distinctive features. They buried their dead carefully, often beneath the floors of their houses or in cemeteries near their settlements. Some burials included grave goods, shell beads, carved bone objects, even pet dogs buried with their owners. This suggests a society with some social complexity, with individuals who held special status, and with spiritual beliefs about death and an afterlife. These weren't just temporary camps. These were communities, places where people lived, died, and were remembered. But the Natufian way of life faced a challenge. Around 10,800 BC, the climate shifted. The Younger Dryas, that final cold snap of the Ice Age, brought drier conditions to the Near East. The wild cereal stands that had been so abundant began to thin. The easy harvests of previous centuries became more difficult. Some Natufian villages were abandoned. Population appears to have declined. The people faced a choice: return to fully mobile foraging, or find new ways to ensure their food supply. This is where the story becomes particularly interesting. During the late Natufian period, roughly 10,800 to 9,500 BC, we see evidence of something new. People weren't just harvesting wild cereals, they were beginning to cultivate them. At sites in the Levant, archaeologists have found the remains of wild rye and einkorn wheat in contexts that suggest they were being deliberately planted and tended, not just gathered where they grew wild. How can we tell the difference between gathering and cultivation? The evidence is subtle but telling. The distribution of plant remains at sites changes. Species that wouldn't normally grow together in the wild appear together, suggesting they were brought together by humans. The proportion of cereals in the diet increases dramatically. Weeds that are characteristic of cultivated fields appear. And most tellingly, the plants themselves begin to show genetic changes that result from human selection, though these changes would take many generations to become pronounced. At Abu Huraira, a site in northern Syria near the Euphrates River, there's evidence that rye may have been under early cultivation between about 11,000 and 10,000 BC. The people of Abu Huraira lived in pit houses, semi-subterranean structures dug into the ground. They harvested wild plants intensively, but the evidence suggests they were doing more than just gathering. They may have been planting seeds, protecting the growing plants, perhaps even watering them. These weren't full-scale farmers with fields of domesticated crops, but they were taking the first tentative steps down the path toward agriculture. Why did people begin cultivating plants? The traditional narrative suggests it was a response to stress, to the declining availability of wild foods during the Younger Dryas. When the easy abundance of the early Natufian period ended, people had to work harder to maintain their food supply. Cultivation was part of that increased effort. But there may have been other factors as well. Once people had settled into permanent villages, returning to a fully mobile lifestyle may have been unappealing. The villages represented an investment, both material and social. People had houses, storage facilities, burial places of their ancestors. They had established territories and relationships with neighboring communities. There were compelling reasons to stay put, and cultivation was a way to make that possible even when wild resources were less abundant. The experiments with cultivation during the late Natufian set the stage for what came next. Around 9,500 BC, a new cultural phase emerged in the Levant, one that archaeologists call the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, or PPNA for short. The PPNA marks the transition to fully Neolithic, or New Stone Age, communities. Though interestingly, these early farming communities didn't yet make pottery. That invention would come later. What they did have was architecture, agriculture, and a settled way of life. PPNA villages were more substantial than Natufian ones. Houses were still circular, following the traditional pattern, but they were larger and more solidly built. Walls were constructed of stone or mud brick. Floors were plastered, creating smooth, clean surfaces. Some houses had internal features like hearths, storage bins, and platforms that may have served as beds or work surfaces. These were purpose-built structures designed for permanent occupation, not temporary shelters. But it was the relationship with plants that really distinguished the PPNA from what came before. The people of PPNA villages were practicing intensive cultivation of wild cereals. They were planting, tending, harvesting, and storing grain on a scale that made it their primary food source. This was still cultivation of wild plants rather than fully domesticated crops. The genetic changes that define domestication, things like non-shattering seed heads that don't scatter their seeds naturally, take many generations of selection to develop. But the agricultural way of life, the dependence on cultivated plants, was now established. One of the best-known PPNA sites is Jericho, which has a strong claim to being one of the oldest continuously occupied settlements in the world. PPNA Jericho was a village of perhaps 200 to 300 people, built around a spring that provided reliable water. The village had stone walls, though whether these were for defense, flood control, or some other purpose is debated. It had a massive stone tower, circular and solid, more than 8 meters tall and 8 meters in diameter. The purpose of this tower remains mysterious. It's too massive to have been purely defensive, and its construction would have required thousands of hours of labor. It may have had some ceremonial or symbolic significance, a monument to community identity and cooperative labor. Around the same time as the PPNA was developing in the Levant, similar developments were occurring in other parts of the Fertile Crescent, the arc of relatively well-watered land that stretches from the Levant through southern Turkey and down into the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia. By about 10,200 BC, fully developed Neolithic cultures of the PPNA type had formed in several locations across this region. Each had its own local characteristics, its own style of architecture, its own tool-making traditions. But they shared the fundamental pattern: settled villages, substantial houses, and an economy based on intensive plant cultivation. These early farming communities weren't isolated. There's evidence of contact and exchange over considerable distances. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for making sharp tools, was traded hundreds of kilometers from its sources in central Turkey to sites throughout the Levant and Mesopotamia. Shells from the Mediterranean and Red Sea appear at inland sites. This tells us that networks of exchange existed, that people and goods were moving across the landscape, carrying not just materials but also ideas, techniques, and perhaps seeds. It's important to understand that this transition to farming wasn't a sudden revolution, despite how it's sometimes portrayed. It unfolded over millennia, with many steps forward and probably some steps back. The shift from gathering wild cereals to cultivating them to fully depending on domesticated crops took thousands of years. For generations, people probably did all three, gathering some wild plants, cultivating others, and gradually selecting and improving the cultivated varieties until they became distinct domesticated species. Nor was the transition to farming inevitable or irreversible in its early stages. Some groups who experimented with cultivation may have abandoned it and returned to foraging if conditions changed or if the labor demands became too burdensome. The evidence suggests that for a long time, the farming way of life remained confined to certain favorable regions of the Near East. It hadn't yet spread to Europe, to most of Africa, or to Asia beyond the immediate environs of the Fertile Crescent. The rest of the world was still inhabited by foragers, hunters and gatherers following ways of life that had sustained humanity for hundreds of thousands of years. But in the Fertile Crescent, something new had been born. Villages of hundreds of people, living in permanent houses, storing food for the lean months, cultivating plants, and beginning the long process of domesticating them. These communities were developing new social structures to manage their larger populations and their stored resources. They were creating new technologies, new forms of art and ritual. They were transforming their landscape, clearing land for cultivation, channeling water, storing grain. They were also, though they couldn't have known it, setting humanity on a new path. The agricultural way of life that began in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 BC would eventually spread across most of the world. It would allow human populations to grow far beyond what foraging could support. It would lead to larger settlements, to towns and eventually cities. It would create the economic surplus that allowed for specialization of labor, for people who didn't produce food but who made tools, or built structures, or served as priests or leaders. It would lead to social stratification, to states and empires, to writing and civilization. But all of that lay in the future. In the centuries around 9000 BC, it was simply a new way of living, one that some communities in the Near East were experimenting with, building permanent houses, planting seeds, harvesting grain, and settling down in one place instead of following the ancient human pattern of movement across the landscape. It must have seemed, to the people living through it, like a reasonable response to their particular circumstances, a way to make the most of the abundant cereals that grew in their region. They could hardly have imagined that they were beginning a transformation that would eventually reshape human existence across the entire planet. The villages of the early Holocene Levant were small islands of settled life in a world still dominated by mobile foragers. They were experimental communities, trying out new ways of living, new relationships with plants and place. Some would succeed and grow, others would be abandoned. But the experiment had begun, and over the following millennia, the balance would shift. Agriculture would spread, villages would multiply, and the Neolithic way of life would gradually become the dominant pattern across much of the world. But that spread was slow, taking thousands of years. For now, in the early Holocene, farming was still a local phenomenon, a curiosity practiced by a few communities in the Near East, while the vast majority of humanity continued to live as humans always had, hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants in an endless seasonal round. Tools, settlements, and the architecture of a new life. The shift to settled farming life required more than just the decision to plant seeds and stay in one place. It demanded new technologies, new tools designed for tasks that mobile foragers had never needed to perform on such a scale. It required new forms of architecture, structures built to last not just a season but for generations. And it created new challenges of organization and cooperation, as larger groups of people lived together permanently for the first time in human history. In the villages of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic period, we can see all of these elements coming together, creating the foundation for a fundamentally new way of life. The tools of PPNA communities reflect their new relationship with plants. At sites like Jericho and Murabet, a settlement on the Euphrates River in what is now northern Syria, archaeologists have found abundant evidence of specialized tools designed for harvesting and processing cereals. The most characteristic of these are flint sickles, cutting tools with carefully shaped blades set into wooden or bone handles. These weren't simple knives. They were purpose-built harvesting implements, designed to cut through the stems of cereal plants efficiently. The flint blades of these sickles show distinctive wear patterns. Under magnification, the cutting edges display a characteristic polish, a smoothing of the stone surface caused by repeated contact with plant stems. This sickle sheen, as archaeologists call it, is diagnostic. It tells us not just that these tools were used to cut plants, but specifically that they were used to cut grasses and cereals. The silica in plant stems creates this polish over time, and its presence on ancient tools is direct evidence that people were harvesting grain in large quantities. The effort that went into making these sickles shouldn't be underestimated. Flint knapping, the art of shaping stone into tools, requires considerable skill. The blade needs to be the right shape, with a properly formed cutting edge. It needs to be fitted securely into a handle, which might be done with adhesive made from tree resin, with careful binding using cordage, or with a combination of both. A well-made sickle was a valuable tool, one that would be used repeatedly over many harvests, maintained and resharpened as needed. Alongside sickles, PPNA sites have yielded numerous grinding stones. These come in two parts, a flat or slightly concave lower stone called a quern, and an upper stone called a hand stone or muller that was rubbed back and forth across the quern. Between these two stones, grain could be ground into flour. This process was labor-intensive. It required considerable strength and effort to grind enough flour to feed a family, and it was work that needed to be done regularly, perhaps daily. The grinding stones found at PPNA sites often show deep wear marks, grooves worn into the stone by thousands of grinding motions, testament to the hours of labor they represented. But this labor was necessary. Wild cereal grains, and even early cultivated varieties, have tough husks that need to be removed before the grain can be eaten. Grinding accomplishes this, breaking open the husks and crushing the grain into a form that can be made into porridge or flatbread. The presence of so many grinding stones at PPNA sites tells us that cereals had become a staple food, something people were eating in large quantities, not just an occasional supplement to a diet still based primarily on hunted meat and gathered plants. The systematic harvesting and processing of cereals that these tools represent was happening even before the plants were fully domesticated in the genetic sense. The wheat and barley that PPNA communities were cultivating were still wild types, or at least early in the domestication process. But the practice of agriculture, the cycle of planting, tending, harvesting, storing, and consuming cultivated grain, was already established. The tools had been developed, the techniques had been learned, and the economic and social structures needed to support this way of life were in place. This intensive cereal cultivation generated surpluses, at least in good years. After the harvest, after taking out enough grain for immediate consumption and for next year's planting, there might be grain left over. This surplus needed to be stored, protected from moisture, rodents, and insects. PPNA communities developed various storage solutions. Some grain was kept in large pottery vessels, though pottery itself was still a relatively new invention and wasn't yet widespread. More commonly, grain was stored in pits, carefully dug into the ground, sometimes lined with stone or plaster to keep moisture out. Some PPNA structures appear to have been purpose-built storehouses. These were buildings without the features of domestic houses, without hearths or living spaces, but with features suited to storage: thick walls for insulation, limited openings to keep pests out, and substantial floors to keep stored goods off the damp ground. The existence of these specialized storage structures tells us something important about PPNA society. Stored food represented wealth, and that wealth needed to be managed and protected. Questions that mobile foragers had never needed to answer now became pressing. Who owned the stored grain? How was it distributed? Who decided when to open storage and how much to use? These questions of ownership and distribution likely required new forms of social organization. In a mobile foraging band, food is generally shared. A successful hunter shares meat with the band because meat spoils quickly and because reciprocity ensures that everyone benefits when hunting fortune varies. But stored grain doesn't spoil quickly, and it can be controlled by individuals or families. The emergence of storable surpluses probably led to the emergence of more pronounced inequalities than had existed in foraging societies, with some families accumulating more stored food than others, and with that accumulated wealth translating into influence and status. The settlements where all this was happening were unlike anything that had existed before. Jericho, known archaeologically as Tel es-Sultan, stands out as perhaps the most remarkable of the early farming villages. Located in the Jordan Valley, near a permanent spring that provided reliable water, Jericho was occupied by around 9,600 BC and would remain occupied, with some interruptions, for thousands of years, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth. PPNA Jericho was substantial. At its height during this period, it may have covered an area of about 6 acres and housed 200 to 300 people. That might not sound large by modern standards, but it was enormous compared to the foraging camps that had characterized human settlement for hundreds of thousands of years. This was a community where hundreds of people lived side by side, where the decisions and actions of individuals affected many others, where cooperation and coordination were essential. The archaeological layers at Tel es-Sultan, spanning roughly 10,000 to 8,000 BC, provide a detailed record of early settled life. We can see the development of the site over time, the rebuilding and expansion of structures, the accumulation of debris that comes from long-term occupation. Houses were built, lived in, and eventually abandoned or deliberately demolished, with new structures built on top of the remains. Over centuries and millennia, this process created the artificial hill, or tell, that gives the site its modern name. What's particularly striking about PPNA Jericho is its architecture. The people of Jericho were building with mud brick, sun-dried blocks of clay mixed with straw or other organic material, and shaped into standardized units. This was revolutionary. Earlier structures had been built with stone, which had to be found in appropriate sizes or laboriously shaped, or with wood and plant materials, which were perishable. Mud brick was different. It could be made in any quantity, formed into uniform blocks that could be stacked to create walls of any desired height and thickness. The use of mud brick with clay mortar made Jericho one of the earliest known places with architecture built from standardized brick units. This wasn't just a technical innovation, it was a conceptual one. It required thinking of a wall not as a single structure, but as an assembly of identical units. It required standardization, ensuring that bricks were roughly the same size so they would stack properly. It required organization, with different people making bricks, others constructing walls, and coordination between these activities. The houses built from these mud bricks were substantial circular structures. Walls might be a meter or more thick at the base, creating sturdy buildings that could support roofs and that provided good insulation against the heat of summer and the cold of winter nights. Floors were carefully plastered, creating smooth, hard surfaces that could be swept clean. Some houses had multiple rooms, or at least subdivided internal spaces. These were dwellings meant to last, homes in the truest sense, places where families lived their entire lives and where multiple generations might reside in succession. But the most enigmatic structure at PPNA Jericho wasn't a house. It was a massive stone tower, standing more than 8 meters tall and 8 meters in diameter at the base. Inside the tower was a staircase, 22 steps hewn from the solid stone, leading to the top. This tower, along with associated stone walls that surrounded at least part of the settlement, has sparked considerable debate among archaeologists. Was it defensive, a fortification protecting the village from raiders? Was it a flood defense, protecting against periodic inundation when the nearby spring flooded? Or was it something else entirely, perhaps a ceremonial structure, a monument to community identity and cooperative achievement? The defensive interpretation has its problems. The tower is inside the wall rather than incorporated into it, which is an odd position for a defensive structure. And it's not clear who the people of Jericho would have been defending against. There's little evidence of warfare during this period, no weapons clearly designed for human combat, no signs of violent destruction at settlements. The tower may have served multiple purposes: a lookout, a symbol of community prestige, a structure with ritual significance, and perhaps also a practical defense against occasional threats. What's undeniable is that it represents a massive investment of labor. Thousands of person-hours would have been required to quarry the stone, transport it, and construct the tower. This required organization, leadership, and the ability to mobilize communal labor for a project that offered no immediate benefit in terms of food or shelter. Jericho wasn't unique in developing substantial architecture during this period. At Wadi Faynan in southern Jordan, in the copper-rich hills of the Arabah Valley, archaeologists have discovered evidence of large oval or round buildings occupied between roughly 9,600 and 8,200 BC. These structures were associated with some of the earliest farmers cultivating local crops. The buildings at Wadi Faynan were substantial, with foundations and lower walls of stone and superstructures probably of mud brick or wooden reeds. What's particularly interesting about Wadi Faynan is its location. This isn't the most obviously fertile area. It's semi-arid, receiving limited rainfall. But it has certain advantages: reliable springs, wild cereals that could be cultivated, and later, access to copper ore. The presence of early farming communities at Wadi Faynan tells us that the agricultural way of life wasn't confined to the most favorable environments. People were learning to farm in more challenging conditions, adapting their techniques to local circumstances. The architecture of these early farming communities reflects a fundamental shift in the human relationship with place. Mobile foragers build temporary shelters, structures meant to last a season or perhaps a year. They are not worth a huge investment of labor because they'll be abandoned when the band moves to the next camp. But when people settle permanently, architecture takes on new importance. A house becomes a long-term investment, worth building solidly because it will be used for many years. It becomes a marker of identity, a place where children are born and elders die, a physical anchor for family and community memory. The labor required to build these structures was considerable, but it was labor that a settled community could afford to invest. Farming provided a more reliable food supply than foraging in most circumstances. It generated surpluses that could support people through periods when they weren't directly involved in food production. During the weeks or months between planting and harvest, labor could be directed to other projects: building houses, constructing storage facilities, creating defensive or ceremonial structures, making tools and other goods. This ability to direct labor toward projects other than immediate food acquisition was one of the most important consequences of the agricultural transition. It created the possibility of specialization, of some people spending at least part of their time on activities other than farming. It created the possibility of communal projects, of building walls and towers and ceremonial centers. It created the possibility of art and craft, of producing goods beyond the strictly utilitarian. All of these possibilities were just beginning to be realized in the PPNA villages of the Fertile Crescent. They would be developed much further in the millennia to come. The villages of the PPNA period, with their mud brick houses, their grain storage facilities, their sickles and grinding stones, their towers and walls, represent a new form of human community. These were places where hundreds of people lived together permanently, where food was stored and managed, where substantial architecture created a built environment. They were places that required new forms of social organization, new ways of making decisions, new mechanisms for resolving disputes and coordinating activities. They were also, we should note, still quite small by later standards. The largest PPNA villages probably didn't exceed a few hundred people. They didn't have writing, or metal tools, or pottery. They didn't have states or formal governments or social classes in the way we usually think of them. In many ways, they were still quite close to the foraging way of life that had preceded them. People still hunted wild animals to supplement their cultivated crops. They still gathered wild plants. They still used stone tools. The full development of what we think of as civilization, with cities and states and complex social hierarchies, was still thousands of years in the future. But the foundation had been laid. The fundamental transition from mobility to permanence, from reliance on wild resources to cultivation of domesticated ones, from small bands to larger villages, had been made. The villages of the PPNA would grow into the larger settlements of later Neolithic periods. Those settlements would eventually become towns, and some of those towns would become cities. The simple mud brick houses of Jericho would evolve into more complex structures, and eventually into palaces and temples. The basic pattern of settled agricultural life had been established, and on that pattern, all of later Near Eastern civilization would be built. Monumental beginnings and global trends. In the hills of southeastern Turkey, in a landscape of rolling plains and limestone ridges that seems unremarkable at first glance, stands one of the most enigmatic and important archaeological sites ever discovered. Göbekli Tepe, which translates as Potbelly Hill, has rewritten our understanding of early human societies and challenged long-held assumptions about the relationship between settled life, agriculture, and monumental architecture. What makes this site so remarkable is not just its age. Though at roughly 9,500 years old it predates Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years, but what that age implies about the people who built it. The earliest monumental enclosures at Göbekli Tepe date to the second half of the 10th millennium BC, roughly 9,500 to 9,000 BC. These structures were built during a transitional period, when agriculture was just beginning in nearby regions but had not yet become the dominant way of life. The people who constructed Göbekli Tepe appear to have been, in economic terms, still primarily hunter-gatherers, or at most, practitioners of very early forms of cultivation. Yet they were capable of organizing and executing construction projects on a scale that demands we reconsider what hunter-gatherer societies could achieve. The site consists of multiple circular enclosures, each defined by massive T-shaped stone pillars arranged in rings. These pillars are not rough-hewn boulders dragged into position and left as nature made them. They are carefully shaped limestone monoliths, some standing more than 6 meters tall and weighing as much as 10 tons. The pillars have a distinctive form, a vertical shaft topped by a horizontal capstone, creating the T-shape that gives them their name. This form is thought to represent a highly stylized human figure, with the vertical shaft as the body and the horizontal element suggesting shoulders or a head. But what truly sets these pillars apart is their decoration. Many are carved with elaborate reliefs depicting animals: foxes, boars, wild cattle, gazelles, snakes, scorpions, spiders, and birds, particularly vultures. The carving is sophisticated, showing a keen eye for naturalistic detail and considerable skill in working stone. Some pillars show just a single animal, others display complex scenes with multiple creatures. The animals aren't merely decorative. They must have held symbolic significance, perhaps representing clans or groups, or embodying spiritual forces important to the people who carved them. The construction of these enclosures required extraordinary effort. The limestone pillars had to be quarried from nearby bedrock, shaped to the desired form, and then transported to the construction site and erected. Quarrying marks at a nearby limestone outcrop show where some pillars were extracted, still attached to the bedrock by narrow bridges of stone that would have been the last pieces cut before the pillar could be moved. Moving a 10-ton stone without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals, using only human muscle power and simple tools, is a daunting task. It requires organization, planning, and large numbers of people working in coordination. Erecting the pillars was equally challenging. Deep pits had to be dug into the bedrock to receive the base of each pillar. The pillar then had to be raised to vertical, perhaps by levering it up using logs and ropes, filling in around the base with rubble and smaller stones to hold it in position. The precision with which this was done is impressive. The pillars stand in regular circles, each positioned carefully in relation to its neighbors. This wasn't haphazard construction. Someone planned these enclosures, designed their layout, and directed the work crews who built them. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from the lowest levels of the site confirms that the earliest circular enclosures with T-shaped pillars were constructed between approximately 9,500 and 9,000 BC. This makes them not just the oldest monumental architecture at the site, but among the oldest monumental stone structures anywhere in the world. They predate the pyramids of Egypt by more than 6,000 years. They are older than Stonehenge by a similar margin. They were ancient even when the first cities of Mesopotamia were being built. What makes this chronology so significant is what it says about the people who built Göbekli Tepe. Traditional archaeological thinking held that monumental architecture was a product of settled agricultural societies. The reasoning was straightforward. Building monuments requires surplus food to feed workers, specialized craftsmen to do the skilled work, and some form of centralized organization to plan and direct the project. All of this, it was thought, only arose after agriculture provided the economic surplus and the settled lifestyle that allowed complex societies to develop. Göbekli Tepe turns this sequence on its head. The earliest phases of construction at the site appear to predate the full development of agriculture in the region. The people who built it were still living primarily by hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants, though they may have been experimenting with early cultivation. They didn't live at the site permanently. Excavations have found remarkably little evidence of everyday domestic activity within the enclosures. No hearths, no trash pits full of food waste, no signs of residential structures. The enclosures appear to have been used for gatherings, for ceremonies, for rituals, but not for daily life. This suggests a different model for the relationship between social complexity and economic change. Perhaps it wasn't agriculture that enabled the construction of monuments. Perhaps, in some cases, it was the other way around. The regular gatherings needed to build and use a site like Göbekli Tepe would have brought together large numbers of people. These people needed to be fed during their time at the site. Perhaps the need to feed gathering crowds provided an incentive for more intensive food procurement, for cultivation of wild cereals, for the early steps toward agriculture. The monument, in this view, didn't result from agriculture. It helped cause it. Whether or not this provocative theory is correct, Göbekli Tepe clearly demonstrates that hunter-gatherer societies, or societies in transition from hunting and gathering to farming, were capable of remarkable achievements. They could organize large-scale labor projects. They possessed sophisticated artistic and symbolic systems. They had reasons to invest enormous effort in creating structures that served no obvious practical purpose in terms of shelter or food production, but that must have been central to their spiritual and social lives. The site wasn't built all at once. Multiple phases of construction have been identified, spanning from the late 10th millennium BC through the early 9th millennium BC. The earliest enclosures are the largest and most impressive, with the biggest pillars and the most elaborate carving. Later phases show smaller structures, less ambitious in scale though still substantial. Walls were rebuilt, new pillars were added, and the site was continuously modified and maintained over a period of perhaps 1,000 years or more. Eventually, for reasons that remain unclear, the enclosures were deliberately buried. The spaces between the pillars were filled with rubble and soil, covering the structures completely. This wasn't natural abandonment with gradual silting and collapse. It was intentional interment, a ceremonial closing of the site. Perhaps the beliefs that had made Göbekli Tepe important had changed. Perhaps new religious ideas had superseded the old ones. Whatever the reason, the great enclosures were covered over, and the site was abandoned, to remain hidden for 9,000 years until its rediscovery in the late 20th century. Göbekli Tepe wasn't unique, though it is the largest and best preserved example we have. Other sites in the region show similar features, suggesting this was a widespread tradition rather than an isolated phenomenon. At Neveli Kori, about 50 kilometers to the northeast, a settlement founded later in the 9th millennium BC featured T-shaped pillars similar to those at Göbekli Tepe. The pillars at Neveli Kori were smaller, but they showed the same distinctive form and similar carved decoration, including animal figures and abstract symbols. Neveli Kori also included what archaeologists have identified as a cult building, a rectangular structure that appears to have served a special, probably ritual purpose. The building was larger than ordinary houses and had unusual architectural features, including a terrazzo floor, a carefully plastered surface made from crushed limestone. Inside were benches along the walls and, most strikingly, stone pillars similar to those at Göbekli Tepe, standing like sentinels within the building's interior. The similarities between Göbekli Tepe and Neveli Kori suggest a broader regional tradition of monumental ritual architecture. These weren't isolated experiments by individual communities, but part of a shared cultural pattern that extended across southeastern Anatolia. There may have been other sites as well, still undiscovered or only partially excavated. The landscape is rich with tells, artificial mounds created by successive occupations, and new sites with Neolithic remains are discovered regularly. It's possible that we've only scratched the surface of understanding the monumental traditions of this region and period. What were these sites for? The most common interpretation is that they served as ceremonial centers, places where people gathered for rituals, feasts, and perhaps for the exchange of goods, information, and marriage partners. In a world where most people lived in small, dispersed groups, such gathering places would have been important for maintaining social connections across a wider region. They might have been neutral ground where different bands or tribes could meet without conflict. They might have been places where important ceremonies were held, rites of passage marking life stages, or seasonal festivals aligned with astronomical events. The prominence of animal imagery at these sites suggests that the rituals performed there had something to do with the relationship between humans and the animal world. This was a critical concern for hunter-gatherer peoples, whose survival depended on successful hunting. The ceremonies might have been intended to ensure hunting success, to honor the spirits of slain animals, or to maintain the cosmic balance between predator and prey. Some scholars have suggested that the vultures carved on many pillars relate to practices of excarnation, exposing the dead to be consumed by scavengers as part of funerary rituals, though this remains speculative. Another possibility is that these sites were related to the social changes accompanying the transition to agriculture. As people began to settle down, as populations grew and territories became more defined, conflicts over resources might have increased. Ceremonial centers could have served as places where disputes were resolved, where alliances were formed, where the social order was negotiated and reinforced through ritual. The massive pillars, the elaborate decoration, the sheer effort invested in these places, all speak to their importance in the social and spiritual lives of the communities that built and used them. What's particularly intriguing is the relationship between these monumental sites and the development of agriculture. Göbekli Tepe and similar sites date to precisely the period when cultivation was beginning in the Near East. Some of the wild plant species that would later be domesticated grew naturally in the area around Göbekli Tepe. Wild einkorn wheat, one of the first cereals to be domesticated, has been found at nearby sites in forms that suggest early cultivation. Is it merely coincidence that monumental ritual architecture and the beginnings of agriculture appear at the same time and in the same region? Some archaeologists have proposed that the causation runs from monument to agriculture rather than the reverse. The large gatherings needed to build and use sites like Göbekli Tepe created a demand for food that couldn't be met by ordinary hunting and gathering. To feed crowds of workers and celebrants, people needed to intensify their food procurement, to harvest and store wild cereals on a larger scale, and eventually to cultivate them. In this view, it was the social and ritual importance of the monuments that drove the economic changes leading to agriculture, not the other way around. This is a provocative idea, and it's difficult to prove or disprove. What is clear is that the period from about 9,500 to 8,500 BC in southeastern Anatolia and the northern Fertile Crescent was one of remarkable innovation and change. People were building monuments on a scale never seen before. They were settling into permanent or semi-permanent villages. They were experimenting with plant cultivation. They were developing new tools, new art forms, new social structures. All of these changes were interconnected, each influencing the others in complex ways. The monuments of this period stand as testimony to the capabilities and aspirations of early Holocene societies. They required vision, the ability to imagine something that didn't exist and to plan its creation. They required leadership, people who could organize labor and coordinate complex projects. They required belief, some shared sense that the effort was worthwhile, that the monuments served purposes important enough to justify the enormous investment of time and energy. And they required cooperation, large numbers of people working together toward a common goal. In these requirements, we can see the seeds of much that would come later in human history. The same qualities that allowed people to build Göbekli Tepe would later allow them to build cities, to organize states, to create civilization. The monuments of the early Holocene weren't primitive or simple. They were sophisticated achievements, products of societies that were complex in ways we're only beginning to understand. They remind us that the boundary between simple hunter-gatherers and complex agricultural societies is far less clear than we once thought, and that human creativity and social organization have deep roots extending far back into the past. A new phase, the domestication of animals and the spread of villages. By around 9000 BC, the agricultural revolution in the Near East was entering a new phase. The tentative experiments with plant cultivation of the previous millennium were solidifying into established practice. But more significantly, people were beginning to transform their relationship not just with plants but with animals as well. The domestication of livestock would prove to be as important as the domestication of crops, providing not just food but also raw materials, labor, and wealth that could walk on its own legs. This period, which archaeologists call the Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, or PPNB, saw the consolidation of the farming way of life and its spread across a wider area of the Near East. The PPNB, beginning around 9000 BC, can be distinguished from the earlier PPNA period in several ways. Most obviously, the architecture changed. Where PPNA houses had been circular, following ancient traditions that probably went back to the round tents and huts of mobile foragers, PPNB houses were increasingly rectangular. This might seem like a minor detail, but it represents an important conceptual shift. Rectangular buildings are more efficient in terms of space use. They can be built adjacent to each other, sharing walls, allowing for denser settlements. They can be easily subdivided into rooms, creating more complex interior spaces. The shift to rectangular architecture marks a move toward a more settled, more permanent, more built way of life. But the most significant development of the PPNB period was the domestication of animals. Between 10,000 and 9000 BC in Southwest Asia, several animal species were brought under human control, beginning a process that would fundamentally alter both human societies and the animals themselves. This wasn't a sudden transformation. Domestication is a gradual process, taking many generations, as humans select for certain traits and as animals adapt to living in close association with people. But by the PPNB period, the process was well underway, and its effects were becoming apparent in the archaeological record. Sheep were among the first animals to be domesticated. Wild sheep, specifically the species known as the mouflon, were native to the mountainous regions of the Near East. These animals lived in flocks, had a social hierarchy, and were relatively tolerant of human presence compared to more skittish prey animals. These characteristics made them suitable candidates for domestication. Humans probably began by simply following wild sheep flocks, hunting them opportunistically. Then they might have started managing the flocks more actively, protecting them from predators, guiding them to good pasture, perhaps corralling them in certain areas. Over time, humans began selecting which animals to kill and which to keep. They might have preferentially hunted the larger, more aggressive males while keeping the smaller, more docile ones for breeding. They might have selected for animals that matured faster or that were easier to handle. Gradually, the managed sheep flocks began to differ from wild ones. Genetic changes accumulated. Physical characteristics shifted. Behavior changed. The animals became dependent on human management, less able to survive on their own. They had become domestic sheep. The archaeological evidence for early sheep domestication comes from several sources. Changes in the age and sex distribution of sheep bones at sites suggest that people were managing flocks rather than just hunting wild animals. In a wild population, you'd expect to see bones from animals of all ages and both sexes, reflecting the natural demographic structure of the population. In a managed flock, you see more bones from young males, which would have been culled to maintain the flock at a manageable size, and from old ewes that were no longer productive. The preservation of breeding-age females would have been essential for maintaining and growing the flock. There are also skeletal changes that indicate domestication. Domestic sheep tend to be smaller than wild ones, a common effect of domestication across many species. Their horns often change shape or size, becoming smaller or curved differently than in wild sheep. These morphological changes take many generations to develop, so when we see them in the archaeological record, we know domestication has been established for some time. Following close behind sheep came goats. Wild goats, particularly the species known as the bezer, inhabited similar mountainous terrain to wild sheep and had similar behavioral characteristics that made them amenable to domestication. Goats and sheep were often managed together, and both provided similar resources: meat, hides for leather, and eventually, as selective breeding continued, wool and milk. The domestication of goats appears to have occurred slightly after sheep, but by the early PPNB period, domestic goats were established in the northern Levant and in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran. Pigs were domesticated around the same time, though their domestication followed a somewhat different pattern. Wild boar were widespread across the Near East, Europe, and Asia. They were adaptable animals that could thrive in various habitats, from forests to marshes. Unlike sheep and goats, which are herd animals comfortable in open terrain, pigs are more individualistic and prefer wooded or scrubby areas. The domestication of pigs probably began with wild boar being attracted to human settlements by garbage and food scraps. People might have tolerated them initially, then started actively feeding them, then perhaps corralling them, and eventually selectively breeding them for docility and productivity. Domestic pigs provided meat and fat, both valuable resources. They were efficient converters of food scraps and forage into protein. Unlike sheep and goats, which need to graze on grassland, pigs can thrive on almost anything edible, making them particularly useful in forested areas or around settlements where they could forage on waste. However, pigs can't be herded over long distances the way sheep and goats can, so they were more associated with settled village life than with mobile pastoralism. The domestication of these animals had profound effects on human societies. Most obviously, it provided new sources of food. A domestic flock was essentially a stored food supply that maintained and reproduced itself. Unlike stored grain, which can be consumed but not replaced except by planting and harvesting a new crop, a carefully managed flock could provide meat year after year while maintaining or even increasing its numbers. This created a form of wealth that was renewable and that could be accumulated over time. But domestic animals provided much more than just meat. Their hides could be made into leather for clothing, footwear, bags, and other uses. Leather was more durable and versatile than plant fiber textiles. Later, as breeding continued, sheep would develop woolly coats that could be shorn and spun into yarn, though this development was still in the future during the early PPNB. Eventually, people learned to milk sheep and goats, providing another valuable food product, though again, the evidence for dairying comes somewhat later than the initial domestication. The management of domestic animals also required and enabled different patterns of land use than plant cultivation alone. Sheep and goats need pasture, areas of grassland where they can graze. In regions where rainfall was sufficient for farming, animals could be pastured on fallow fields or on land that was too steep or rocky to cultivate. In drier regions, where farming was marginal or impossible, pastoralism could become the primary subsistence strategy, with people following their flocks in seasonal migrations between pastures. This pastoral way of life would become important in the steppes and semi-arid regions surrounding the core agricultural areas. The PPNB period saw these developments in animal domestication occurring alongside continued refinements in plant cultivation. The suite of crops that would define Near Eastern agriculture was being established. Wheat and barley were the staple grains. Lentils, peas, chickpeas, and other pulses provided protein and helped maintain soil fertility through nitrogen fixation. Flax was cultivated for its fibers, which could be spun into linen thread, and for its oil-rich seeds. Together, these crops and the domestic animals formed an agricultural package that could support large populations, and that would eventually spread far beyond its Near Eastern origins. As agriculture and animal husbandry became more established, settlement patterns changed. Across the Fertile Crescent, from the Levant in the west through southern Turkey and down into the Zagros Mountains of western Iran, the late 10th and early 9th millennia BC saw a proliferation of permanent villages. Small, seasonally occupied camps, the traditional settlement pattern of foragers and semi-sedentary groups, were increasingly replaced by year-round villages with substantial architecture, storage facilities, and all the features of permanent habitation. These villages were larger and more numerous than earlier settlements. While PPNA Jericho had been exceptional in its size and complexity, PPNB sites of similar or even greater scale became more common. Villages with hundreds of residents, covering areas of several acres, were established across the region. The density of human occupation in the agricultural heartland of the Near East was increasing dramatically. Population was growing, both within individual settlements and in terms of the total number of settlements across the landscape. The sites that appear during this period show considerable variation, reflecting local adaptations to different environments and perhaps different cultural traditions. In the northern Levant, sites like Ain Ghazal near modern Amman in Jordan grew to substantial size during the PPNB, eventually becoming one of the largest settlements of the Neolithic period. The site featured rectilinear houses with multiple rooms, plastered floors, and courtyards. The architecture shows careful planning and sophisticated construction techniques, including the use of lime plaster for floors and walls. At Muribet, on the Euphrates River in northern Syria, excavations have revealed a sequence of occupation spanning from the late Natufian period through the PPNB. The site shows the transition from circular to rectangular architecture and from primary reliance on wild resources to dependence on cultivated plants and domestic animals. The stratigraphy at Muribet provides a detailed record of how the agricultural transition unfolded over time in this region, with gradual rather than sudden changes in technology, economy, and settlement pattern. In the Zagros Mountains of western Iran, Ganj Dara is a key site for understanding early village life and the beginnings of animal domestication in this eastern part of the Fertile Crescent. Occupied primarily during the late 10th and early 9th millennia BC, Ganj Dara shows evidence of plant cultivation and, critically, some of the earliest evidence for goat domestication. The site consists of multi-room rectilinear structures built of mud brick, arranged in a dense settlement pattern. Storage facilities, both above-ground bins and below-ground pits, indicate that substantial food surpluses were being accumulated. What's striking about sites like Ganj Dara is their location in the Zagros Mountains, an area that today is relatively marginal for agriculture due to its elevation and climate. But during the early Holocene, with a climate that was somewhat warmer and moister than today's, these highland valleys were productive zones where wild cereals and pulses grew naturally and where wild goats and sheep were abundant. The people of Ganj Dara and similar sites were taking advantage of this productivity, transforming wild resources into domestic ones and establishing a farming and herding way of life in the highlands. These various sites, scattered across the Fertile Crescent, show that the Neolithic way of life was not a single, uniform development radiating from one center. Rather, it was a complex process with multiple regional variations, local innovations, and different trajectories. Communities in different areas were solving similar problems: how to feed growing populations, how to build permanent settlements, how to organize social life. But they were doing so in ways adapted to their particular environments and influenced by their own cultural traditions. Yet there were also clear connections and exchanges between regions. Obsidian from sources in central Turkey has been found at sites hundreds of kilometers away in the Levant and Mesopotamia. Seashells from the Mediterranean or the Red Sea appear at inland sites. Similarities in artistic styles, architectural techniques, and tool types suggest cultural contact and the spread of ideas. The people of the PPNB Near East weren't isolated in their individual villages. They were part of a wider world, connected by trade, by the movement of people, by shared traditions and mutual influences. It's important to note that even with all these developments, permanent villages, domestic crops and animals, substantial architecture, growing populations, full urban civilization was still thousands of years away. These were villages, not cities. They didn't have writing, or bronze tools, or wheeled vehicles, or any of the other technologies we associate with the first civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Social organization was probably relatively egalitarian compared to later periods, without the pronounced hierarchies of fully developed states. Political organization extended no further than the village and perhaps loose associations of neighboring villages. But the foundation was being laid. The PPNB societies of the Near East had established the economic basis, agriculture and animal husbandry, that would support all later developments. They had created the settlement pattern, permanent villages with substantial populations, that would eventually give rise to towns and cities. They had developed many of the technologies and social practices that would characterize Near Eastern civilization for millennia to come. The seeds planted during this period, both literal and figurative, would grow into the great civilizations of the Bronze Age and beyond. But that flowering still lay far in the future. For now, in the 9th millennium BC, humanity was still learning what it meant to live as farmers and herders, to dwell in permanent houses in settled villages, to manage domestic crops and animals, to live in close proximity with hundreds of neighbors. It was a new way of life, one that would spread across much of the world in the millennia to come, transforming human existence in ways both profound and permanent. Broadening the human world. The agricultural revolution that began in the Near East was not humanity's only response to the changing world of the early Holocene. Across the globe, human communities were adapting to new environments, developing new technologies, and in some regions, beginning their own independent experiments with plant and animal domestication. The period from 9000 to 7000 BC saw the human world expand and diversify, with different societies following different paths, some toward agriculture, others toward increasingly sophisticated hunting and gathering strategies. This was a world of multiple trajectories, multiple innovations, and multiple solutions to the challenges and opportunities presented by the post-Ice Age climate. The agricultural developments in the Near East were part of a broader global pattern. Between about 10,000 and 7,000 years ago, rapid domestication of plants and animals occurred in multiple centers across the tropical and subtropical world. In Asia, Africa, and Central America, people were independently discovering how to transform wild species into domestic ones, how to cultivate plants and manage animals. The window of 10,000 to 9,000 BC represents the very beginning of this global trend, the first stirrings of a transformation that would eventually see farming spread to nearly every corner of the inhabited world. These independent centers of domestication are significant because they demonstrate that agriculture wasn't a single invention that spread from one source. Rather, it was a development that occurred multiple times, in different places, with different plants and animals. In China, millet and rice would be domesticated. In Africa, sorghum, African rice, and various native crops. In Mesoamerica, maize, beans, and squash. In South America, potatoes, quinoa, and a host of other crops. In each region, people worked with the wild species available to them, gradually transforming them through selection and cultivation into productive domestic varieties. The fact that agriculture arose independently in so many places suggests that it wasn't a rare stroke of genius or a chance discovery made by one particularly clever group. Rather, it was a response to conditions that existed widely in the early Holocene: warming climate, changing vegetation patterns, growing human populations in certain regions, and perhaps social and cultural factors that made settled life attractive. When conditions were right and when the appropriate wild species were available, people in various parts of the world figured out how to cultivate plants and domesticate animals. But not all human societies moved toward agriculture, even in regions where it was possible. Many continued as hunters and gatherers for thousands of years, and some societies that had experimented with cultivation actually moved away from it, returning to foraging strategies. This was the case in parts of Egypt during the period around 10,000 to 9,000 BC. Earlier, during the late Pleistocene and the very early Holocene, communities along the Nile had practiced intensive cereal processing, using specialized sickle blades to harvest wild grasses. These groups had been on a trajectory that seemed to parallel the Near Eastern shift toward cultivation. But around 10,000 to 9,000 BC, something changed in the Nile region. The intensive cereal processing declined. The specialized sickle blades became less common. Instead, people turned to a broader spectrum of resources: hunting, fishing, and gathering a wider variety of wild plants. This shift corresponds to environmental changes in the region. As the climate of the early Holocene established itself, the Nile and its floodplain underwent changes in their seasonal patterns, in vegetation, and in the availability of different resources. Rather than becoming more dependent on cereals and moving toward agriculture, the people of this region adapted by diversifying their subsistence base. They hunted the game that was abundant in the well-watered Nile Valley and the surrounding regions, which during this period received more rainfall than today. They fished in the Nile and its associated lakes and marshes, taking advantage of rich aquatic resources. They gathered a wide variety of wild plants. This broad-spectrum strategy was successful, allowing populations to thrive without the need to commit to agriculture. This Egyptian example reminds us that the transition to farming wasn't inevitable or universally desirable. In some environments and circumstances, hunting and gathering remained a viable and perhaps even preferable strategy. The adoption of agriculture involved trade-offs. It could support larger populations and provide storable surpluses, but it also required more labor, reduced dietary diversity, and created new vulnerabilities to crop failure and social conflict. Not all societies chose to make that trade. While people in the Near East and North Africa were working out their relationships with plants and animals, other human groups were pushing into new territories, adapting to environments that had been inhospitable or inaccessible during the Ice Age. In South America, hunter-gatherer populations were spreading across the continent, reaching even the southernmost regions of Patagonia by around 10,000 BC. At Fells Cave in southern Chile, near the Strait of Magellan, archaeological excavations have uncovered clear evidence of human occupation dating to around 10,000 BC. The deposits at Fells Cave contain hearths, layers of ash and charcoal from ancient fires where people cooked food and warmed themselves against the cold Patagonian climate. Animal bones found at the site tell us what these early inhabitants were hunting. The remains include species that are now extinct, native horses, which died out in the Americas at the end of the Ice Age, and giant ground sloths, massive creatures that stood several meters tall and browsed on trees and shrubs. The presence of these extinct animals in association with human artifacts confirms both the early date of the occupation and the fact that the first Americans witnessed and hunted the megafauna that would soon disappear. Among the most distinctive artifacts from Fells Cave are spear points with an unusual shape. These fishtail points, named for their characteristic basal form that resembles a fish's tail, are finely crafted by facial tools, worked on both sides to create sharp edges and a symmetrical form. The craftsmanship is impressive, showing that the makers had considerable skill in stoneworking and that they took care to produce well-made, aesthetically pleasing tools. These weren't crude or expedient implements. They were carefully designed hunting weapons, the product of a well-developed technological tradition. What makes these fishtail points particularly interesting is their distribution. Similar points have been found at sites scattered across South America, from southern Chile and Argentina north through Uruguay, Brazil, and into other parts of the continent. This wide distribution suggests long-distance cultural connections. Either the same group of people spread rapidly across vast distances, carrying their distinctive tool-making tradition with them, or different groups were in contact with each other, exchanging ideas and perhaps goods, maintaining a shared cultural tradition across a huge geographical area. The presence of these early hunter-gatherers in Patagonia, at the very southern tip of South America, just a few thousand years after the first widely accepted evidence of humans in the Americas, speaks to the remarkable adaptability and mobility of these populations. Within a relatively short time, perhaps just a few thousand years, people had spread from the north, probably entering from Asia via Beringia, all the way to the southern end of the continent, a distance of some 15,000 kilometers. They had adapted to every environment along the way: temperate forests, grasslands, deserts, mountains, and the cold steppes of Patagonia. This was a stunning achievement, one of the great migrations in human history. The toolkit from Fell's Cave and similar sites shows that these weren't desperate refugees barely surviving in harsh environments. The careful workmanship of the stone tools, the evidence of successful big-game hunting, the presence of well-chosen campsites near resources, all indicate competent, successful adaptation. These people knew their environment, understood the behavior of the animals they hunted, and possessed the technology and skills needed to thrive in what might seem to us like an unforgiving landscape. While South American hunter-gatherers were adapting to Patagonia, their counterparts in North America were engaged in their own expansion and adaptation. In eastern North America, the period from about 9,500 to 9,000 BC is associated with early Paleo-Indian groups who made large, distinctive fluted spear points. These Clovis or Clovis-like points, named after the site in New Mexico where they were first identified, are among the most recognizable artifacts of early American prehistory. Clovis points are characterized by their large size, their careful bifacial workmanship, and most distinctively, by the flute or channel that runs partway up each face of the point from the base. This flute was created by removing a long, thin flake from each side of the point, a delicate operation that required considerable skill, and that sometimes resulted in the point breaking and being discarded. The purpose of the flute has been debated. It may have made it easier to half the point to a wooden shaft, creating a secure attachment. It may have had some functional advantage in penetration or blood flow when the point was used to kill an animal. Or it may have had cultural or aesthetic significance, a marker of identity and craftsmanship. The people who made Clovis points were highly mobile. The same point style appears across vast areas of North America, from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from Canada to Mexico. Within any particular region, Clovis sites are often found in diverse environments: river valleys, uplands, near former lakes, in what were then grasslands or forests. This pattern suggests groups that were exploring and colonizing new territories, not yet settled into specific, well-known ranges, but rather learning the landscape, discovering resources, and establishing themselves in a land that was still relatively empty of humans. In the southeast, the diverse environments of the region, with its river systems, its forests and grasslands, its abundant game, provided rich opportunities for these early colonizers. Archaeological sites from this period show that people were exploiting a wide range of resources. Large game like mastodons and bison where they were available, but also deer, smaller mammals, birds, fish, and turtles. Plant foods would have been important as well, though they leave less trace in the archaeological record than animal bones and stone tools. The mobility of these early Paleo-Indian groups would have been considerable. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers in similar environments suggest that annual ranges, the total area covered in a year's seasonal movements, might encompass several thousand square kilometers. Over a lifetime, individuals might travel tens of thousands of kilometers. This mobility would have facilitated the rapid spread of populations across the continent, and would have maintained cultural connections across wide areas, explaining the broad distribution of distinctive tool types like Clovis points. But mobility has its costs. Highly mobile groups can't accumulate many possessions. Everything has to be carried, so tools and equipment must be limited in number and preferably lightweight. Social ties might be harder to maintain when groups are constantly on the move, splitting and recombining in different configurations. Knowledge of any particular locality might be less detailed than for more sedentary groups who know every feature of a restricted territory intimately. These trade-offs between mobility and other adaptive strategies would shape human societies for millennia to come. The picture that emerges from this global survey of the period from 9000 to 7000 BC is one of tremendous human diversity and adaptability. In the Near East, people were becoming farmers, settling in permanent villages, domesticating plants and animals. In parts of Africa, people were maintaining successful foraging economies, adapting to changing environments without adopting agriculture. In South America, hunter-gatherers were spreading across a continent, adapting to environments ranging from tropical forests to cold southern steppes, hunting animals that would soon become extinct. In North America, highly mobile Paleo-Indian groups were exploring and colonizing diverse landscapes, developing sophisticated hunting technologies and widespread cultural connections. There was no single human story during this period, no universal trajectory that all societies followed. Instead, there were many stories, many paths, many solutions to the challenges of life in the early Holocene. Some societies would eventually adopt agriculture and settle down. Others would remain hunter-gatherers for thousands of years, developing their own sophisticated technologies and rich cultures. Some societies would grow in population and spread across wide areas. Others would remain small and localized, maintaining traditional ways of life in particular environments they knew intimately. What united all these diverse societies was their fundamental humanity, the capacity for language and symbolic thought, for technological innovation, for social cooperation, for adapting to new challenges and opportunities. Whether building monuments in Turkey, cultivating wheat in the Levant, hunting slards in Patagonia, or exploring the forests of the American Southeast, humans were demonstrating the flexibility and creativity that have always been our species' greatest strengths. The choices made during this period, the paths taken or not taken, would shape the development of human societies for millennia to come. But in the centuries around 9000 BC, multiple futures still seemed possible, and the human world was expanding, diversifying, and experimenting with new ways of living in a new world. European landscapes, early innovation, and the shadows of violence. As the Holocene climate stabilized and warmed during the period from roughly 9700 to 9000 BC, Europe underwent a dramatic ecological transformation. The vast expanses of tundra and open steppe that had characterized the Ice Age landscape began to disappear, replaced by expanding woodlands. This wasn't a gradual, imperceptible change taking place over geological timescales. In human terms, it was remarkably rapid. Within just a few centuries, within the span of a few human generations, landscapes that had been open and treeless became forested. This transformation fundamentally altered the distribution of game animals and forced human populations to develop new hunting strategies and adapt to life in a very different environment. During the Ice Age, much of Europe had been dominated by what ecologists call the mammoth steppe, cold, dry grasslands that supported herds of large grazing animals. Reindeer, horses, bison, and mammoths had roamed these open landscapes, and human hunters had developed sophisticated strategies for exploiting these herding species. Success often depended on understanding migration patterns, on being at the right place at the right time to intercept moving herds, on cooperative hunting strategies that could bring down large, dangerous prey. The openness of the landscape worked in hunters' favor. Animals could be seen from great distances. Approach routes could be planned. Drives could channel herds toward cliffs or into marshes where they could be dispatched more easily. But as the climate warmed and moisture increased, this open landscape began to close. Trees advanced from their Ice Age refugia, spreading northward and upward in elevation. Birch and pine came first, hardy pioneer species that could tolerate harsh conditions. Behind them came other species, oak, elm, hazel, and lime. Within a few centuries, dense mixed woodlands covered much of what had been open steppe. The character of the European landscape had fundamentally changed. For the human inhabitants, this transformation presented both challenges and opportunities. The great herds of reindeer and horses that had been central to Ice Age subsistence moved northward, following the retreating tundra and open grasslands, or else their populations declined and fragmented. The megafauna, the mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses and giant deer, were already extinct or on the verge of extinction. The animals that thrived in the new forested landscape were different: red deer, roe deer, wild boar, and smaller game like birds and hares. These animals didn't form the large, predictable herds that Ice Age hunters had relied on. They were more solitary or lived in small groups. They could hide in dense vegetation. Hunting them required different strategies. European hunter-gatherers of the early Holocene, the people of what archaeologists call the Mesolithic period, developed new approaches suited to forest hunting. The bow and arrow became increasingly important, more useful in woodland where quick shots at animals glimpsed between trees were more common than long-range throws across open ground. Hunting strategies became more diverse and opportunistic, targeting whatever game was locally available rather than depending on the seasonal migrations of large herds. Fishing became more important in many regions, taking advantage of the numerous rivers, lakes, and coastal resources that provided protein when terrestrial hunting was unproductive. The diet broadened as well. Forest environments offer a wealth of plant foods: nuts like hazelnuts and acorns, berries, roots and tubers, edible greens, mushrooms. Archaeological evidence from Mesolithic sites shows intensive exploitation of these resources. Hazelnuts in particular seem to have been an important food, with charred hazelnut shells found in huge quantities at some sites, representing hundreds of thousands of individual nuts. Collecting and processing these plant foods required considerable labor, but they provided a reliable food source that could sustain people through seasons when game was scarce. Settlement patterns changed too. In the open landscapes of the Ice Age, people had been highly mobile, following the herds across vast territories. In the forests of the early Holocene, movement became more restricted. The forest itself was harder to move through, with dense vegetation impeding travel. Resources were more evenly distributed rather than concentrated in the huge herds of the past. Many Mesolithic groups became less mobile, occupying more restricted territories, returning to the same campsites repeatedly or even establishing semi-permanent base camps that were occupied for much of the year. These changes in subsistence, technology, and settlement represent a significant adaptation to new environmental conditions. European hunter-gatherers successfully navigated the transition from Ice Age to Holocene, from open steppe to dense forest. But their way of life would face another challenge in the millennia to come, as farming, domesticated from the Near East, gradually spread into Europe, bringing with it new economies, new technologies, and new social structures. For now, though, in the early Holocene, the Mesolithic peoples of Europe were thriving in their forested world, developing rich and sophisticated cultures adapted to the particular demands of woodland life. While Europeans were adapting to forests and Near Easterners were developing agriculture, another important technological innovation was emerging in the Middle East. By about 9000 BC, people had begun working with native copper, creating some of the earliest known metal artifacts in human history. This early metalworking wasn't yet the sophisticated copper smelting that would characterize the later Copper Age or Chalcolithic period. It was simpler, the working of native copper, pure copper found in metallic form in nature, through cold hammering and annealing, heating and hammering to shape it into desired forms. Native copper occurs in several places in the Middle East, particularly in regions of what are now Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. The metal could be found as nuggets or thin sheets in certain geological formations. Its distinctive reddish color and its malleability would have made it immediately interesting to people familiar with working stone, bone, and other materials. Unlike stone, which must be chipped or ground to shape, copper can be hammered, bent, and formed. It's soft enough to work with stone tools but hard enough to be useful. And when hammered, it work hardens, becoming stronger and more durable. The earliest copper artifacts from this period are small and simple, beads and pendants, decorative items rather than tools. Sites in northern Iraq, including locations in the Zagros Mountains, have yielded hammered copper beads dated to around 9000 BC. These would have been prestige items, rare and valued, worn as personal ornaments to display wealth or status. The skills required to work copper, even in its native form, would have been specialized knowledge, probably possessed by only a few individuals in any community. These early metalworkers were the distant ancestors of the smiths who would later smelt copper from ore, who would alloy copper with tin to make bronze, who would eventually work iron and steel. It's important to note that this early copper working didn't immediately revolutionize technology. Stone remained the primary material for tools for thousands of years. Copper was too rare and too soft to replace stone for most purposes. But the discovery that metals could be worked, that they had useful properties, that they could be shaped and formed in ways that stone couldn't be, planted a seed that would eventually grow into the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. The manipulation of metals would become one of the defining technologies of later civilizations. But in 9000 BC, it was just beginning, an exotic craft practiced in a few locations, producing small trinkets that hinted at possibilities to come. These early experiments with metalworking represent human curiosity and innovation, the willingness to try new materials and new techniques, to see what could be done with the resources available. This same innovative spirit characterized many aspects of life in the early Holocene. New approaches to hunting, new crops and animals being domesticated, new forms of architecture and settlement, new tools and weapons. Humanity in this period was experimenting, adapting, innovating in response to new challenges and opportunities. Not all experiments succeeded, but the ones that did would shape the future. But the early Holocene wasn't just a time of innovation and adaptation. It was also a time when the darker aspects of human nature manifested in ways that have left stark evidence in the archaeological record. At Naturuk, a site in what is now Kenya, near the shores of ancient Lake Turkana, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of violence on a scale that's difficult to contemplate. A massacre dating to between roughly 8,500 and 7,500 BC. The site preserves the remains of at least 27 individuals, men, women, and some who may have been pregnant, whose skeletons show signs of traumatic injury consistent with violent death. The injuries are brutal and unambiguous. Some skulls show fractures consistent with blows from blunt instruments, possibly wooden clubs, though these haven't been preserved. Other individuals have projectile points, arrowheads or spear points, embedded in their bones or found in positions suggesting they were lodged in soft tissue that has since decomposed. Some bodies appear to have been bound, their hands and feet in positions suggesting they were tied at the time of death. The bodies weren't carefully buried but were left where they fell, some in what would have been the shallow water at the lake's edge. This is evidence of violence on an organized scale, not a skirmish or a series of individual killings, but a coordinated attack on a group of people. The term massacre seems appropriate. This was probably an attack by one group on another, for reasons we can only speculate about: conflict over resources, revenge for some previous wrong, competition for territory. The presence of women and children among the victims suggests this wasn't a battle between warriors but an attack on a community or a family group. Naturuk is significant because it dates to a period when most archaeologists had assumed large-scale violence was rare or absent. The traditional view was that warfare and organized violence emerged only with the development of agriculture, settled life, and the accumulation of property and resources worth fighting over. Hunter-gatherers, according to this view, were too mobile, too egalitarian, and too scattered to engage in warfare. Conflicts might occur, but they would be individual or small-scale, not the organized violence between groups that we call warfare. Naturuk challenges this comfortable assumption. The people who were killed there were hunter-gatherers, living by fishing, hunting, and gathering in the well-watered environment of the early Holocene Lake Turkana region. They had no agriculture, no permanent villages in the sense of the Near Eastern farming settlements. Yet they were victims of organized violence, killed in large numbers in what appears to be a planned attack. This suggests that the capacity for warfare, for organized violence between groups, is older and more fundamental to human societies than we might wish to believe. The reasons for the violence at Naturuk remain speculative. The Lake Turkana region during the early Holocene was relatively well-watered and productive, supporting populations of hunter-gatherers. But even in productive environments, resources are finite. Competition could arise over access to the best fishing areas, to productive foraging territories, to reliable water sources. Population growth could put pressure on resources. Social conflicts could escalate. Group identities could harden, creating us versus them mentalities that made violence against outsiders more acceptable. It's also possible that violence, or at least the capacity for it, played a role in human social life that went beyond competition for resources. Displays of strength, the ability to defend territory or to retaliate against wrongs, might have been important for group prestige and survival. Raiding and counter-raiding might have been a normal, if regrettable, part of the social landscape, a way of establishing dominance, acquiring prestige, or maintaining social boundaries between groups. Violence might have been as much a social and symbolic activity as an economic one. Whatever the specific causes, Naturuk stands as a sobering reminder that human history has always included violence alongside innovation and cooperation. The same species that built monuments like Göbekli Tepe, that domesticated plants and animals, that created art and music and complex social bonds, was also capable of organized violence, of killing neighbors and strangers in conflicts whose causes are now lost to time. This duality, the capacity for both remarkable cooperation and terrible violence, has characterized human societies throughout history. Naturuk shows us that it was present from the earliest times, that it's not a product of civilization or agriculture or any particular social structure, but something more fundamental to our nature. The early Holocene world, then, was complex and multifaceted. It was a time of environmental transformation, as Ice Age landscapes gave way to the warmer, wetter conditions of the Holocene. It was a time of human adaptation, as people in different regions developed new subsistence strategies suited to new environments. It was a time of innovation, as people experimented with new technologies, from metalworking to new hunting weapons to agricultural practices. It was a time of demographic expansion, as human populations grew and spread into new territories. But it was also a time of continuity with the deeper human past. Despite all the changes, most people still lived as their ancestors had for hundreds of thousands of years, by hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants, moving across familiar landscapes in seasonal rounds, living in small groups bound by kinship. The full transition to agricultural societies, to settled village life, to the social complexity that would eventually produce cities and states, was underway in only a few regions. Most of humanity still lived by older patterns that had sustained our species through the Ice Age and into the new world of the Holocene. And woven through all of this, through the adaptation and innovation and expansion, were the eternal themes of human existence: cooperation and conflict, creation and destruction, the capacity for both remarkable achievement and terrible violence. These themes, present in the early Holocene, would continue to characterize human history in all the centuries and millennia to come. The story of humanity is not a simple narrative of progress or decline, but a complex tapestry of choices and consequences, innovations and adaptations, triumphs and tragedies. In the period from 9000 to 7000 BC, we see all of these elements present, setting patterns that would echo through the rest of human history. Trade, technology, and cultural exchange. As human societies adapted to the new conditions of the Holocene, and as some regions developed agriculture and settled village life, new needs and opportunities emerged. Permanent settlements required organization and coordination on scales that mobile foraging bands had never needed. Growing populations had to manage resources, distribute goods, and maintain social order. These challenges stimulated innovations in record keeping, in technology, and in the networks of exchange that connected communities across wide distances. The period from 9000 to 5000 BC saw the emergence of systems and technologies that would lay the groundwork for the more complex societies that would follow. One of the most significant, if seemingly modest, innovations of this period was the development of systems for keeping track of things, goods, animals, obligations, transactions. By roughly 10,000 BC, small clay objects that archaeologists call tokens begin to appear at sites in the Fertile Crescent. These tokens came in various standardized shapes: spheres, discs, cones, cylinders, and more complex forms. Each shape appears to have represented a particular type of commodity or a specific quantity. A cone might represent a measure of grain. A sphere might represent a certain number of animals. A cylinder might stand for another type of good. These tokens represent one of the earliest known systems for tracking goods or animals with physical counters. They weren't writing, not yet. They didn't record language or specific information beyond simple quantities and categories. But they were a crucial step toward writing and toward the kind of record-keeping that complex societies require. With tokens, someone could keep track of how much grain was in storage, how many sheep were in a flock, what goods had been exchanged or owed. This kind of accounting becomes increasingly important as communities grow larger, as wealth accumulates, as exchange becomes more complex. The use of tokens would continue and develop over thousands of years. Eventually, tokens would be enclosed in clay envelopes, sealed containers that protected the tokens but concealed what was inside. To solve this problem, people began marking the outside of the envelope with impressions showing what tokens it contained. Eventually, someone realized that if you marked the envelope, you didn't need the tokens inside at all. The marks themselves were sufficient. This realization led to the development of clay tablets with impressed symbols, which eventually evolved into cuneiform writing, the world's oldest known writing system. But that development was still thousands of years in the future. In the early Holocene, tokens were a simple but effective solution to the problem of keeping track of things in an increasingly complex world. The early Holocene world wasn't just shaped by human innovations and adaptations. Natural events, particularly volcanic eruptions, continued to affect climate and environment in ways that humans had to respond to. The 9th millennium BC saw at least 3 major volcanic eruptions that would have had significant regional and possibly global impacts. These eruptions reached a volcanic explosivity index of 5 or higher, meaning they ejected tens of cubic kilometers of ash and volcanic material into the atmosphere. The largest of these eruptions occurred at Grímsvötn in Iceland. This volcanic system, hidden beneath the ice cap of the Vatnajökull Glacier, produced a massive eruption that sent enormous quantities of ash, rock, and aerosols into the atmosphere. When volcanoes erupt on this scale, they can affect climate over wide areas, sometimes globally. The ash and especially the sulfur dioxide released by the eruption combine with water vapor in the stratosphere to form tiny droplets of sulfuric acid. These droplets reflect incoming sunlight, reducing the amount of solar radiation that reaches the Earth's surface. The result can be cooling, sometimes significant cooling lasting for a year or more. Another major eruption occurred at Ulljundo, a volcanic island near Korea in the Sea of Japan. This eruption would have affected Eastern Asia, depositing ash over a wide area and potentially disrupting local climates and ecosystems. And in the southern hemisphere, Mount Taupo in New Zealand produced a major eruption that would have had regional effects in the Pacific. Each of these eruptions was a significant event, the kind of natural catastrophe that could affect human populations in the affected regions, disrupting food supplies, contaminating water sources, and forcing people to adapt or relocate. For the human populations living through these events, volcanic eruptions would have been mysterious and terrifying phenomena. The sky would darken with ash. The sun might appear dimmed or reddened. Unusual weather patterns might occur, cooler temperatures, unusual precipitation, crop failures. Without scientific understanding of volcanoes and their effects, people would have interpreted these events through the lens of their religious and spiritual beliefs, perhaps seeing them as manifestations of divine anger or supernatural forces. These eruptions added to the complex environmental shifts that humans were already experiencing after the end of the Ice Age. The rapid climate changes of the transition from Pleistocene to Holocene, the rising seas, the expansion of forests, the extinction of megafauna, all of these were happening during the same general period as these volcanic events. Human societies in the early Holocene were navigating a world of constant environmental change, where conditions could shift within a human lifetime, where the landscape and climate weren't stable and predictable, but dynamic and sometimes capricious. While dealing with these environmental challenges, human communities continued to develop new technologies and to find new uses for the resources available to them. Flax, a plant that produces both edible seeds and strong fibers, was being harvested in various regions by this time. In areas like what is now Switzerland, archaeological evidence shows that people were collecting flax around 9000 to 8000 BC. The seeds could be eaten or pressed for their oil, which is rich in omega-3 fatty acids. But perhaps more important in the long run was the fiber. Flax fibers come from the stem of the plant. After the plant is harvested, it must undergo a process called retting, where the stems are soaked in water or exposed to dew and moisture over time. This allows bacteria to break down the pectin that binds the fibers to the woody core of the stem. After retting, the softened stems can be beaten and scraped to remove the woody material, leaving the long, strong fibers. These fibers can then be twisted together to make cord or thread, which can be woven into fabric. Linen, the textile made from flax fiber, would become one of the most important textiles in the ancient world. It was used for clothing, for sails, for rope, for 100 different purposes. It was particularly valued in hot climates because linen is cool and absorbent, comfortable to wear in summer heat. The ancient Egyptians would famously dress their pharaohs in fine linen and would wrap their mummies in linen bandages. But all of that was still far in the future. In the early Holocene, flax was just beginning to be used, its potential just starting to be realized. The development of fiber technology, whether from flax or from other plant materials like hemp or from animal sources like wool, was crucial for human societies. Good rope and cordage are essential for countless tasks: securing shelters, making nets and snares for hunting and fishing, creating carrying bags, constructing tools and weapons. Textiles for clothing allowed people to live comfortably in a wider range of climates. The ability to work with fibers, to twist them into strong thread, to weave thread into fabric, was a technology as important in its way as stone tool making or fire use. All of these developments, the tokens for accounting, the adaptations to volcanic impacts and climate change, the exploitation of new resources like flax, took place within the context of what archaeologists call prehistoric technology. This was the long era before writing, before large-scale metallurgy, when human toolkit consisted primarily of stone, bone, antler, wood, and, in a few places, early native metals worked by hammering rather than smelting. These materials might seem primitive from a modern perspective, but in the hands of skilled craftspeople, they were remarkably effective. Stone tools, for instance, could be extremely sharp. Obsidian, volcanic glass, can be worked to create edges sharper than the finest steel scalpels. Flint and chert could be shaped into a wide variety of tools: cutting and scraping tools for processing hides, drills for making holes in wood and bone, projectile points for hunting. The skill required to make these tools was considerable. A master flint knapper could see in a piece of raw stone the tool waiting to be released, could plan a sequence of carefully placed blows that would remove flakes in just the right way to create the desired form. Bone and antler were also versatile materials. They could be carved and ground into awls for punching holes in leather, into needles for sewing, into harpoons and fish hooks for fishing, into handles for stone tools. Antler, being harder and tougher than most bone, was particularly useful for tools that needed to withstand impact, like wedges for splitting wood or pressure flakers for the final shaping of stone tools. Wood, though it rarely survives in the archaeological record except in special conditions, was undoubtedly one of the most important materials. It could be used for structural purposes in building shelters and houses. It could be carved into bowls, containers, and tools. It could be used for handles and shafts. Fire-hardened wooden spears had been used by humans for hundreds of thousands of years. Bows were made from carefully selected wood with the right properties of flexibility and strength. The knowledge of which woods were best for which purposes, how to season and work them, how to join pieces together, was a crucial part of technological knowledge in prehistoric societies. These prehistoric technologies shouldn't be underestimated. They were the result of hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, experimentation, and refinement. The techniques had been passed down through countless generations, each adding its own small innovations and improvements. The result was a suite of technologies that allowed humans to thrive in virtually every environment on Earth, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest, from coastal zones to high mountains, from deserts to temperate woodlands. Moreover, these technologies were sustainable in a way that many later technologies were not. Stone, bone, and wood could be obtained from the local environment without depleting non-renewable resources. Tools could be repaired, resharpened, and eventually recycled. Knowledge was held collectively and passed on through demonstration and practice rather than depending on written manuals or specialized institutions. These were technologies that could be maintained by small communities without complex infrastructure or extensive trade networks, though such networks did exist and were important. Speaking of trade networks, the early Holocene saw the continued development and expansion of exchange systems that connected communities across considerable distances. Obsidian, that volcanic glass prized for its sharp edges and distinctive appearance, was traded hundreds of kilometers from its sources. In the Near East, obsidian from sources in central Anatolia has been found at sites throughout the Levant and Mesopotamia. Chemical analysis can identify the specific volcanic source of any piece of obsidian, allowing archaeologists to trace ancient trade routes. Seashells, valued for their beauty and probably for their symbolic significance as objects from the boundary between land and sea, were traded far inland from coastal sources. Mediterranean shells appear at sites deep in the interior of the Near East. Red Sea shells moved inland into Africa. The fact that these objects traveled such distances tells us that networks of exchange existed, that communities were in contact with each other over wide areas, that goods, and with them ideas and information, were moving across the landscape. This exchange wasn't commerce in the modern sense. There were no merchants, no markets, no money. Instead, goods probably moved through chains of reciprocal gift-giving, with each community passing valuable items to neighbors as part of ongoing relationships of exchange and alliance. A piece of obsidian might change hands dozens of times, moving a little farther with each exchange, before finally being made into a tool and used at a site hundreds of kilometers from its source. The shell might be passed as a gift at a gathering, carried to a new region, traded again, eventually ending up as a grave good buried with someone who lived a lifetime's journey from the sea where the shell originated. These networks of exchange served multiple purposes beyond the simple movement of goods. They created and maintained social relationships between communities. They allowed for the spread of information and ideas. A new tool technology developed in one region could spread to others through these networks. Knowledge about good hunting areas, about the seasonal availability of resources, about potential dangers or opportunities, could be shared. The networks created a sense of connection and common identity across wider areas than any single community occupied. They also created dependencies and vulnerabilities. A community that relied on traded obsidian for tools was dependent on maintaining good relations with the communities along the trade route. Disruptions to the network, whether from conflict, environmental change, or other causes, could cut off access to valued materials. But in normal times, these networks enhance the resilience and adaptability of participating communities, providing access to a wider range of resources and knowledge than any single group could possess or create on its own. The period from 9000 to 5000 BC, then, was one of increasing connection and complexity. Communities that had once been largely isolated were increasingly linked by networks of exchange. Technologies were becoming more diverse and specialized. Systems of accounting and record-keeping were emerging to manage the growing complexity of settled life. Human societies were developing new ways of organizing themselves, new technologies, new forms of social connection. All of this was laying the groundwork for the more complex societies that would emerge in the later Neolithic and the Bronze Age. But it was also a time when the fundamental patterns of prehistoric life still held. Most people still used tools made from stone, bone, and wood. Most communities were still relatively small and relatively egalitarian. Social organization was based primarily on kinship rather than formal hierarchies. Religion and ritual were woven into daily life rather than institutionalized in separate temples and priesthoods. The great transformation that would lead to cities, states, writing, and civilization was still unfolding, still in its early stages. The world of 10,000 to 5000 BC was a world in transition, caught between the ancient patterns of the Paleolithic and the new forms of social organization that would characterize the later Neolithic and the Bronze Age. It was a crucial period, one that set the stage for all that would follow, but one that still retained strong connections to humanity's deep past. Knowledge carriers and networks of exchange. In the millennia between 9000 and 5000 BC, as human societies grew more complex and as specialized knowledge accumulated, certain individuals began to play crucial roles as carriers of information and innovation. Traders and mobile craftspeople, people who moved between communities rather than remaining in a single settlement, became vital conduits through which knowledge, materials, and techniques spread across wide regions. These weren't full-time specialists in the modern sense. There were no professional merchants or itinerant artisans as formal occupations. But there were individuals and families who, through circumstance or inclination, moved more than others, who maintained connections across wider areas, who served as bridges between communities that might otherwise have remained isolated. These knowledge carriers performed multiple functions. Most obviously, they moved materials. Someone might travel to an obsidian source, acquire the volcanic glass through exchange or by direct procurement, and carry it back to their home community or pass it along to others. In the process, they would see how other communities lived, what technologies they used, what techniques they had developed. They might observe a new method of making stone tools, a more efficient way of constructing houses, a clever design for a fishing trap or a grain storage facility. When they returned home or moved on to another community, they carried this knowledge with them. Sometimes the knowledge transfer was direct and intentional. A skilled stoneworker might demonstrate their technique, teaching others how to produce a particular type of tool. Someone who had seen a new architectural method might describe it to builders in their home community, perhaps even helping to implement it. But often the transfer was more subtle and indirect. Simply seeing that something was possible, that another community had solved a problem in a particular way, could inspire innovation. Knowing that a useful material was available in a certain location could motivate others to establish exchange relationships to acquire it. Over generations, these networks of mobile individuals created a web of connections that spanned vast distances. Innovations didn't remain isolated in the communities where they first appeared. They spread, sometimes slowly, sometimes with surprising speed, carried by traders, by traveling craftspeople, by people who married into distant communities, by anyone who moved and who carried knowledge with them. The result was that human societies, even those separated by hundreds or thousands of kilometers, weren't developing in complete isolation. There was cultural flow, a constant if slow exchange of ideas, materials, and techniques that shaped the development of societies across wide regions. One of the most important materials moving through these networks was obsidian. This volcanic glass, with its sharp edges and distinctive appearance, was highly valued for making cutting tools and, in some cultures, for its aesthetic and possibly ritual significance. But obsidian is found only in certain locations, near volcanic activity. Communities that lived far from volcanic sources had to obtain obsidian through trade, and the trade networks that developed to move this material were extensive and sophisticated. Anatolian obsidian, from sources in the Cappadocia region of central Turkey, was one of the most widely traded varieties. By around 8400 BC, this obsidian was reaching as far as Cyprus, the large island in the eastern Mediterranean. This is particularly significant because Cyprus has never been connected to the mainland by a land bridge, not even during the Ice Age when sea levels were much lower. The channel between Cyprus and the nearest mainland, whether Turkey or the Levant, has always been a significant body of water requiring boats to cross. The presence of Anatolian obsidian on Cyprus by 8400 BC tells us that people were making deliberate sea voyages, crossing open water in boats capable of carrying not just people but also cargo. These weren't accidental drifts or desperate refugee flights. They were planned expeditions, probably repeated regularly, that brought obsidian and probably other goods from the mainland to the island. The maritime technology required for such voyages was sophisticated. The boats had to be seaworthy enough to handle open water, large enough to carry multiple people and goods, and sturdy enough to make the return journey. These voyages were part of the early colonization of Cyprus. The island, which had no human inhabitants during the Ice Age, began to be settled in the early Holocene. People brought not just themselves but also plants, animals, and materials from the mainland, establishing communities that would develop their own distinct cultures while maintaining connections with the broader Near Eastern world. The obsidian trade was one mechanism of that connection, ensuring that Cyprus remained linked to mainland developments rather than developing in complete isolation. In the Aegean and Mediterranean, Obsidian from the Greek island of Melos was forming the basis for early maritime networks. Starting around 8000 BC, Melian obsidian was being traded to mainland Greece and to Crete. The distances involved were considerable, particularly the crossing from Melos to Crete, which would have required multiple hours of travel in small boats across open water. Yet the trade existed and appears to have been regular, with Melian obsidian appearing at sites throughout the Aegean region. This trade tells us that maritime technology and navigational knowledge were well developed in the Aegean by the early Holocene. People could reliably make sea crossings, could navigate out of sight of land, could find islands and return home safely. They understood winds and currents, weather patterns and sea conditions. This maritime expertise would be crucial for the later development of Aegean civilizations, from the Minoans of Crete to the Mycenaeans of the Greek mainland to the later classical Greek city-states with their far-flung colonies and maritime trade networks. But the roots of that maritime tradition go back to the early Holocene, to the obsidian traders who first ventured out across the Wine-dark Sea in search of the black glass. The obsidian trade in the Mediterranean extended even further. Lipari, in the Aeolian Islands north of Sicily, was another major obsidian source. By 6000 BC, obsidian from Lipari had reached the coast of Tunisia in North Africa, a journey that would have required crossing substantial stretches of open sea. This wasn't one-way traffic. The Lipari obsidian was being exchanged for goods from North Africa, particularly shells from a species of snail native to the region. These shells appear at sites in Italy, where they were used as decoration on pottery, pressed into the soft clay before firing to create attractive patterns. This impressed ware pottery, with its shell decorations, is characteristic of early farming cultures in Italy and the Western Mediterranean. The exchange between Lipari and Tunisia shows that maritime trade networks weren't just about acquiring raw materials. They were about exchange relationships, about mutual benefit, about communities in different regions trading goods that each valued, but that were locally available to only one of them. These relationships might have had social and political dimensions, as well as economic ones. The exchange of goods might cement alliances, create obligations, establish peaceful relations between communities that might otherwise have been rivals or strangers. While maritime trade was developing in the Mediterranean, overland trade routes were connecting distant regions across the Near East and Central Asia. One of the most remarkable examples involves lapis lazuli, a deep blue semi-precious stone that was highly valued in the ancient world for its beauty and rarity. The primary source of lapis lazuli in the ancient Near East was Badakhshan, a region in what is now northeastern Afghanistan. This is one of the few places on Earth where high-quality lapis lazuli occurs naturally, and it was the source for virtually all the lapis lazuli used in the ancient Near East. By around 5500 BC, lapis lazuli beads from Badakhshan were appearing in graves in Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq. The straight-line distance between Badakhshan and Mesopotamia is roughly 2,000 kilometers. The actual travel distance, following routes through the mountainous terrain of the Iranian plateau, would have been considerably greater. Yet this material was moving that entire distance, passing through multiple hands, crossing multiple territories, traveling for months or perhaps years before reaching its final destination. The journey would have been arduous. The routes passed through high mountain passes in the Hindu Kush and through the Iranian highlands, regions that could be dangerous due to terrain, weather, and potentially hostile groups. But the value of lapis lazuli made the journey worthwhile. In Mesopotamia, where the deep blue color of lapis lazuli was associated with the heavens and with divinity, the stone was used for prestigious objects, cylinder seals, jewelry for the elite, inlays in artwork. It was a luxury material, a marker of wealth and status, worth the considerable effort required to acquire it. The lapis lazuli trade demonstrates the extent and sophistication of exchange networks by the 6th millennium BC. These weren't simple trades between neighbors. They were long-distance networks spanning multiple regions, multiple cultures, multiple languages. They required trust and cooperation among many different communities along the route. They required some means of determining value, of deciding what lapis lazuli was worth in exchange, even though the communities at either end of the trade route had very different economies and resources. The existence of such networks tells us that human societies, even in prehistoric times, were interconnected in ways that transcended local boundaries. In Egypt, the Badarian culture, which flourished along the Nile in Upper Egypt from roughly 5000 to 4000 BC, was also participating in long-distance trade networks. The Badarians imported cedar wood from Byblos, a city on the coast of what is now Lebanon. Cedar was valuable because Egypt, despite the productivity of the Nile Valley, lacks substantial forests. Good timber, particularly the large, straight logs needed for construction and boat building, had to be imported. Cedar from the mountains of Lebanon was the finest timber available in the region, prized for its quality, its pleasant scent, and its resistance to rot and insects. The Badarians also imported obsidian, though from a different source than the Anatolian obsidian that supplied the Levant and Cyprus. Egyptian obsidian came from Nubia, the region to the south along the Upper Nile and into what is now Sudan. This trade connected the Nile Valley communities with cultures to the south, creating networks that would persist throughout Egyptian history, with Nubia serving sometimes as a trading partner, sometimes as a rival, and at some periods as part of a unified Egyptian state. Badarian pottery, characterized by its fine, thin fabric and its distinctive blacktop decoration, created by inverting pots in the fire during the final stages of firing to carbonize the rims, circulated along trade routes that connected the Nile Valley with routes leading to the Red Sea. This eastern trade would become increasingly important in later Egyptian history, connecting Egypt with the Arabian Peninsula and, indirectly, with the trade networks of the Near East and ultimately with the Indian Ocean trade system. Further west, in what is now the Eastern Sahara, communities at Nabta Playa were participating in their own exchange networks. Nabta Playa, a large basin that held a seasonal lake during the wet conditions of the early to mid-Holocene, was home to groups of cattle pastoralists between roughly 7000 and 5000 BC. These weren't farmers, the region was too arid for reliable agriculture. But it was suitable for pastoralism, with seasonal grasses that could support herds of cattle, along with wild game and plant resources that supplemented the diet. The people of Nabta Playa produced ostrich eggshell beads, small disc-shaped beads made by carefully breaking pieces of ostrich eggshell and then drilling holes through them. These beads were lightweight, durable, and attractive, and they were traded with communities in the Nile Valley. In exchange, the Nabta Playa pastoralists received goods from the riverine farmers, grain, perhaps, or tools, or other items not available in the desert. They also traded cattle products, hides, meat, possibly milk, connecting their pastoral economy with the agricultural economy of the Nile Valley. These exchanges between Nabta Playa and the Nile communities are interesting because they show trade between different economic systems, between pastoralists and farmers, between desert and river valley. Such exchanges would become a recurring pattern throughout African history and indeed throughout the world, with pastoral and agricultural communities maintaining relationships of exchange and sometimes conflict, each providing goods and resources the other needed. The mobility of pastoralists made them natural traders, able to move goods across distances that would be difficult for sedentary farmers, serving as intermediaries in larger trade networks. All of these examples, from the obsidian trade in the Mediterranean to the lapis lazuli routes of Central Asia to the exchanges between Egyptian farmers and Saharan pastoralists, illustrate a fundamental aspect of human societies in the period from 9000 to 5000 BC. Despite the lack of states, writing, or formal commercial institutions, people were connected across vast distances. Goods, and with them ideas and innovations, were moving through networks that spanned thousands of kilometers. No community was truly isolated. All were part of larger webs of connection and exchange. These networks were crucial for the development of human societies during this period. They allowed innovations to spread from their points of origin to distant regions. A new crop domesticated in the Fertile Crescent could, over generations, spread to Europe, North Africa, and South Asia. A new tool technology developed in one region could diffuse to others. Artistic styles, architectural techniques, religious ideas, all could move through these networks, carried by traders, by migrants, by anyone who traveled and who carried knowledge with them. The networks also provided a form of resilience. A community that experienced crop failure or resource depletion could potentially obtain needed goods through trade. Information about conditions in other regions could help communities make decisions about whether to stay or move, about what strategies to adopt. The connections created by trade weren't just economic. They were social and informational, providing communities with windows into a wider world beyond their immediate surroundings. But these networks also created new forms of inequality and competition. Materials that had to be acquired through trade became prestige goods, markers of wealth and status. Those who controlled trade routes or who had special access to valued materials could accumulate power and influence. Competition for trade goods could be a source of conflict. The archaeological evidence of violence we discussed earlier, sites like Nataruk, may reflect conflicts over resources that were themselves objects of trade or over control of territories through which trade routes passed. As we reach the end of our journey through the period from 10,000 to 5,000 BC, we can see that the human world had changed dramatically from what it had been at the end of the Ice Age. Agriculture had been invented and was spreading across the Near East and beginning to appear in other regions. Animal domestication had provided new sources of food and raw materials. Permanent villages had been established, with substantial architecture and growing populations. Technologies had become more diverse and specialized, with early metalworking, fiber production, and sophisticated stone tool industries. Systems of accounting had emerged to manage the complexity of settled life. And networks of trade and exchange had linked communities across vast distances, creating an interconnected world in which innovations and ideas could spread far from their points of origin. Yet much remained unchanged. Most of the world's population still lived by hunting and gathering, following ways of life that stretched back hundreds of thousands of years. Stone remained the primary material for tools. Social organization remained relatively simple and egalitarian in most places. Writing didn't yet exist. Cities hadn't been built. States and formal governments hadn't emerged. The great civilizations of the Bronze Age, with their monumental architecture, their complex social hierarchies, their writing systems and bureaucracies, still lay in the future. The period from 10,000 to 5,000 BC was a time of transition, a bridge between the Paleolithic world of mobile hunter-gatherers and the later world of agricultural civilizations. It was a time when the foundations were being laid for all that would follow, when the crucial innovations of plant and animal domestication were made, when humans were learning to live in new ways in a new world. The choices made during this period, the paths taken or not taken, the innovations embraced or rejected, all would shape the course of human history in the millennia to come. It was, in every sense, a pivotal time in the human story, one that deserves to be remembered and understood as the moment when humanity began the long transition that would lead, eventually, to the world we know today.